A normal drive home became a real-life nightmare. Just after 9 on a cool autumn night, the parking lot behind the hardware store in Maple Bridge lay quiet and silver under the streetlights. The town was a small place in Rook County, tucked between cornfields and dark woods, the kind of place where people waved from porches and the corner diner knew how you took your coffee. The late shift had run long. The last customer wanted a new lock and a long conversation, and by the time the receipt printed, the clerk felt the weight of the hour resting on his shoulders. His name was Miles. He was in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered from hauling lumber and salt bags, calm and steady in a way that made people ask him for directions and jumper cables. He locked the back door, breathed in the clean bite of cold air, and told himself the drive home would be a straight line through the quiet. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? He slid into his sedan, a dark blue car with a worn seat and a little squeak in the steering, and checked the time on the dash, 9:12. He sent a quick text to Nora, who ran the morning shift at the bookstore near the river, then tucked the phone into the cup holder. He liked the same route every night. Cross the bridge, take County Road 17 past the water tower, follow the long curve through Pine Hollow, and then a straight shot along Old Quarry Road to his neighborhood. 2 lanes, no traffic lights, a few mailboxes so faded you could not read the numbers even in daylight. A simple drive. The radio came on with a low murmur. He set it to a soft station, something with warm voices and a piano that sounded like it was recorded in a church basement. The car hummed. The river glinted through the trees like a ribbon of graphite. A thin mist hovered just above the asphalt. Every few hundred yards, a farmhouse light glowed in the distance and then slid away behind him. Peace laid over the road like a blanket. At the start of Pine Hollow, the trees crowded in, tall and dense, their black shapes knitting together overhead. The white lines flashed beneath the hood. Miles knew each curve here by muscle memory. He knew where the pavement buckled, where the shoulder dipped, where deer liked to step out of the corn and test their luck. He drove a respectful speed. He had changed a tire at 2 in the morning once and would prefer to never repeat that event. He did not notice the dark car until the last second. It sat on the right shoulder with its hazard lights blinking, hood up, driver door open just a crack. The red flash of the hazards pulsed across the lane and painted the white guardrail a sickly shade. A purse lay on the passenger seat, scattered open like it had been turned over, lipstick rolling into a cup holder, a wallet half out, a key ring dangling. A phone was on the ground near the hinge of the open door. The interior light burned steady, a lonely little sun in an empty cabin. He lifted his foot, not quite braking, just thinking. He had stopped for people before, and he would stop again. But something about the scene pressed a thumb into his ribs. Why the phone on the ground? Why the door ajar? Why no one waving a flashlight or standing in the beams? The car itself looked wrong in a way that was hard to name. Windows dark, like there were blankets taped inside. Hood up, but no steam, no smell of oil, no scratch of tools. He coasted by and told himself he would call it in at the next rise where the cell bars were better. His chest felt tight. He passed and kept passing. The hazards pulsed behind him and then shrank and fell back into the tunnel of the trees. The mirror caught a flicker of movement. He glanced up and felt his throat seize. In the wash of his taillights, a shape unfolded from the abandoned car, too tall to be comfortable inside. It had been crouched behind the steering wheel, folded small, and now it stood in the open door and tilted as if measuring distance. Pale skin or maybe a white mask flashed once and vanished as the hazards blinked. The shape slid back down. The door closed. The hazards stopped. Miles gripped the wheel. He felt the old instinct to turn around and make it right, the same instinct that made him stop for a wandering dog or carry groceries for a stranger. The instinct wrestled with a colder voice that was saying, keep moving, call for help soon. Do not be the person who pulls over for a stage scene. The colder voice won. He pressed the accelerator. The low hills of the hollow rose and fell like a wave train. The radio turned into background static. He checked his phone. No signal. The little triangle sat empty. He lifted the device toward the windshield as if altitude might help. Nothing. He set it down and tried to breathe evenly. A white sign flashed by that warned of sharp turns. The trees pressed close again and the road narrowed. The night felt alive now, the kind of alive that made hairs stand up even under a hat. A pair of headlights appeared in the mirror, far back then closer. He told himself it was a traveler who had come up fast on the straight stretch. He told himself that people tailgate at night because they want your lights to pull them through curves. He told himself to ignore it. The headlights grew larger, bright enough to paint the outline of his back seat. The following car drifted left, then right, then dropped back like a swimmer testing a current. No passing now, not here. Miles kept his speed steady. He did not tap his brakes. He knew that tap could look like a challenge. The following car closed the distance in a quick surge. Its beam climbed the rear glass and stung his eyes. He could see the shape of a tall hood, a long windshield. He could see a dent on the front bumper on the right side. He could see a strip of black tape where a turn signal should have been. The same car. He knew it, bone deep, the way you know the shape of your own hands. His mouth went dry. The road ahead ran straight for a quarter mile before the next bend. At the end of that straight, he could see the faint comfort of a reflective mile marker and the ghostly outline of the old quarry fence. His car could handle 70 for a little while, but anything higher made the engine whine and the steering go light. He pressed the pedal and felt the floor. The following car matched him without effort. It drifted, right until its right front tire kissed the gravel on the shoulder, then snapped left again, a silent show of control that read like a threat. It fell back, then surged forward and bumped his bumper once, a shallow metal kiss that shoved his sedan forward with a hard jolt. The seatbelt cut across his chest. His teeth clicked. He corrected the wheel, breathed out through his nose, kept the lane. Another bump. Harder. A brief grind of metal. He felt a sting along his ribs as the belt bit. The road curved left here. On the right, a black drop into scrub and stone. He had helped tow someone from that ditch at noon in high summer. He had seen the gouge in the dirt that could swallow a wheel. He held the center while his heart pounded like a mallet. Up ahead, a green sign glowed, small, nothing fancy. Tucker Fuel, 3 miles, open all night. He pictured the little island of light by the highway, the gumball machine inside, the ringing bell over the door, the sign that always hung crooked over the coffee pot. He aimed himself at it like a ship aiming for a lighthouse. He kept his speed high enough to keep the space between, low enough that he could control the next curve. The pursuing car hung on his bumper, its brights flared. Miles felt the headache that comes from light burning hot inside the skull. The road leveled. The gas station sign rose up like a promise. A lone pump. A long shadow of a pickup near the side wall. A storefront with cheap blinds and shelves of antifreeze. He took the turn into the lot at a clean angle and stopped close to the door. So close that if anyone wanted his driver door, they would have to squeeze against the building. The other car slid past on the highway, slowed for 3 counts, and then poured on speed and disappeared. No plates were visible. The rear glass looked painted from the inside. The door to Tucker Fuel opened with a bell that sounded eager. The air smelled like coffee and grape soda. A woman behind the counter looked up, shock widening her eyes. Her name tag said, Marla. She wore a faded sweatshirt with a wolf on the front. Miles tried to keep his voice low, but everything came out in short reports. He told her there was a car. He told her the bumps. He told her he needed to call the sheriff. He felt like his words bounced around and did not land, like a dozen beads spinning in a cup. Marla rounded the counter without asking and walked the glass with him. She clicked the deadbolt and pulled the thin chain across the door. She pointed to the phone. He dialed. A calm voice answered at the county dispatch center and asked for location, nature of emergency, description. He gave the mile markers. He gave what he had seen. He tried to be slow and careful, but his breath kept catching. The dispatcher told him to stay inside and to keep the car where it was, nose toward the door. The dispatcher told him a deputy was already on the way from the river bridge and would arrive soon. The dispatcher told him he had done the right thing. Marla poured him coffee without asking. He wrapped his cold hands around the paper cup and stood where he could watch the road. She said he could stand in the office if he wanted. He said here was fine. A minute stretched long. The clock over the chips ticked. A truck rolled past on the highway and kept going, no trouble, just a ghost on a line. Then the red and blue lights bloomed against the glass like a sunrise. Deputy Ana Ruiz stepped out with her hat tilted low against the chill. She moved with the quick stillness of someone trained to be calm when other people are not. She examined the bumper first. The rear right corner had a scar of bare metal where paint was scraped clean, dust of blue curled like dry skin. She crouched and studied the gouge and then took pictures, each one marked by the white flash of her small camera. She asked Miles to repeat his story. He said it again, this time in a voice that sounded like the one he used at the store when he needed to explain a return policy. He heard his own words line up and tried not to think about the way his pulse was still climbing. Another unit arrived. Deputy Reed, a broad man with a radio voice that sounded like gravel. They took statements from Marla, too. She had not seen the other car, but she put her hand on the counter to show how Miles had put his hand on the counter and how cold his skin had been. Ruiz said she would sweep the highway up to the hollow. Reed would go back toward the bridge. If the car was out there, they would find it. They did not find it. Not the abandoned car, not the pursuit car, nothing. There were faint tire marks in the gravel at the place where the hazards had flashed, but the marks were confused by dozens of older tracks and the soft brush of wind. The phone that had been on the ground was gone. If it had ever been there at all, the road had swallowed it. Reed called in from the bridge with the same report. Nothing. The night had closed behind the event like a curtain. Ruiz returned to tuck her fuel and told Miles she would follow him home. She asked if he had someone waiting. He said yes, Nora, at the house near the ball field. He said he would call on the way as the bars returned. She told him to take it slow. She would stay right behind with her lights off until they reached the neighborhood. He thanked her. His gratitude came out rough and quiet. They drove, Ruiz a patient shadow in the mirror. The night felt thinner now, stretched but alive. Miles thought about the figure unfolding from the car. He thought about the way the hazards had clicked off before the pursuit began. He thought about timing and planning and how easy it would be on an empty road to play at hunting. He checked the ditches for any flicker of movement and saw only rows of cornstalks rattling like bones. At home, Nora stood on the porch in a wool jacket, hair tied up in a knot that meant she was tired and annoyed and worried at the same time. A porch light made her face look pale and strong. She took one look at the bumper and swore under her breath. Ruiz spoke to them both. The deputy was careful not to tell them stories. She said there had been reports in neighboring counties of staged breakdowns, cars waiting for good Samaritans, people who had been forced to the shoulder by nudges and then robbed, sometimes just robberies, sometimes worse. She told them to keep the car in the garage if they could, to call if any unfamiliar vehicle idled at the corner for more than a minute, to save the shirt Miles had worn in case residue could be lifted from the fiber. Ruiz did not raise her voice. She spent 20 minutes making sure they had the number to the direct line. Then she left, slowed down the block, pausing once to look back, as if to let the neighborhood know someone was watching. In the morning, Miles noticed a tiny black scuff under the trunk lip. It looked like gum, but felt like hard plastic. He pried it with a flathead screwdriver, and a small rectangular magnet came loose, stuck to a plastic shell no bigger than a matchbox. The device clattered onto the driveway. Inside was a battery and a little printed board with a chipped corner. He had seen trackers online at the store when he stocked the shelves. Not the same brand, but the same shape and use. He took a photo and texted it to Deputy Ruiz with a single sentence that read, "Found this under the trunk." He waited in the kitchen with his second cup of coffee and the quiet thump of the refrigerator. The deputy called back fast. She asked him to seal the device in a sandwich bag and leave it on the porch. She told him she would swing by on her lunch hour to pick it up. She told him he had done the right thing again. He did not feel right. He felt like someone had been inside his life without permission. Work felt like play acting that day. The aisles were the same. The bell over the door made its friendly sound. He cut key blanks and hauled birdseed bags to the tailgate of a pickup. He showed a retired teacher how the garden hoses were organized by length and price. He smiled. The smile drifted. In his mind, he kept seeing the shape unfold from the car and the way the hazards went dark. He kept seeing the long windshield of the chase car and the flat blank of its rear glass. He stepped outside at lunch and stood in the sun to warm up. He listened for tires. He heard only a train on a far line. That evening, he changed his route. He told himself this was not fear. It was caution. He took River Road to the highway and looped past the outlet mall with the bright new stores and the mulch smell from the landscape beds. He made his way to the Maple Lantern Diner and sat at the counter for a bowl of chili with chopped onions and a square of cornbread. The place was cheerful and chrome bright. A man 2 stools down noticed the fresh scrape on the bumper and asked the casual question people ask when they want to hear a good story. Miles gave a simple version and watched the man's face flatten. The man was a long-haul driver who knew every turn on County Road 17. He said he had seen a car with a taped turn signal parked at the pull-off near Black Creek Bridge 2 nights before. He had seen another driver slow and then dart away. He said he had reported it to the highway patrol. He said he had not stopped. He said, "Good on you for not stopping." The weekend came, the town breathed. High school football under the lights filled Friday night with the sound of brass bands and the soft thud of running feet. Saturday morning smelled like cinnamon rolls. Miles and Nora walked the farmer market and pretended the world was as simple as the bushel baskets in front of them. He scraped the garage floor clean and made a neat line of tools and sworn off words. He thought the week had been a lesson and it was over. Sunday night proved him wrong. At 9:24, he turned from the highway onto his street. A dark sedan idled at the corner by the ball field. Its lights were off. There was no driver visible. The windows were too dark. He slowed and looked without turning his head. The car did not move. He passed, parked, and sat with the engine idle, counting to 30. The sedan rolled away as soft as a thought. No plates again, no visible stickers or dents, just the shape of a car built to vanish in plain sight. He did not sleep well. He dreamed of long lanes of white lines that ran out into corn, of doors that closed on their own, of hands under the trunk lip. He woke at 1 to the thrum of a distant engine and lay still listening. It faded. He woke again at 2 to the scrape of tires on gravel. By morning, he felt thinner at the edges, as if his skin had been sanded. On Monday, Ruiz called with an update. The tracker had no stored data that the lab could pull. The chip was cheap and anonymous. It might only have broadcast a low signal to a nearby phone. The deputy said a similar device had turned up in another case near a rest area off the highway. Nothing concrete tied the events together. She told him again to be careful and to call if anything felt wrong. He listened hard to the calm in her tone. He borrowed some of that calm and held it like a tool. The weeks slid by in a way that felt off balance. Twice, he noticed a dark sedan in the distance on his way home. Once at the water tower, once idling near the feed store. He kept his speed controlled and stayed under bright signs in view of cameras and curious staff. He began to think about how many cameras watched the road that saved him, and he felt grateful for their dumb glass eyes and silent patience. He stopped at Tucker Fuel every night, bought a pack of gum he did not need, and stood for a minute making conversation with Marla, who had switched from wolf sweatshirt to a shirt with a faded mountain and a hawk. Routine grew like a shield. On Thursday, a curious piece of news swept through town. The sheriff's office released a short note that asked drivers to avoid stopping for stranded vehicles on unlit 2-lane roads. The note advised pulling into the nearest lit area and calling the situation in from a safe spot. It did not mention arrests. It did not mention a car with a taped light. People read it and nodded. People told other people that you could not be too careful. On Friday, Miles found an old dash camera in a clearance bin at work. He had not wanted to become the sort of person who documented everything, but the old part of him that liked neat rows and hardware that matched said this was a small price for a quiet night. He wired it up before he clocked out and set the little lens to watch the road from the center of the windshield. The camera was not fancy, but the tiny screen showed the white lines bright and honest. Just after 9, he crossed the bridge. He stayed off County Road 17 and took the longer sweep past the mall. He slowed at a yellow light and felt his phone buzz. He did not check it. He rolled past the Maple Lantern and thought about coffee. He chose home. He turned on to Old Quarry Road and let the car settle into that friendly groan it made at 52. The world softened. He exhaled. In the mirror, a dark shape appeared. It hugged the lane divider, then moved to the right, then drifted left. It held back at a steady distance. The distance did not feel like coincidence. He could hear the hollow beat of his own pulse in his ears. He picked his landmark. 2 miles ahead, a warehouse with floodlights sat at the corner of Flint Street. There were always night staff, moving pallets. There were always cameras, bright ones that made even clean cars look guilty. He would not be chased into the woods again. He would pick a bright place and make the line of travel predictable. The dark shape moved closer. It drew up alongside for a breath, then tucked back as if performing a little test. He kept his hands at 10 and 2, felt like a student again, paid attention to his rear bumper and the space that wrapped around him like a bubble. The shape settled in behind. Its lights stayed low. It did not bump this time. It simply shadowed him in a way that said, patience. The word made the skin between his shoulders tighten. The floodlights at the warehouse bloomed white and strong. The lot lay open like a stage. A forklift crossed slow in the far lane. A worker in a neon vest stood smoking near a stack of pallets that seemed to go on forever. Miles eased into the turn lane and hit his signal. The shadow car slowed with him. He thought about pulling mid-lane and stopping hard, letting the pursuer choose. But even in imagination, the tactic felt like a risk that did not pay. He chose a simple entrance and swung into the lot. The dark sedan rolled past instead of turning. It coasted to the far side of the intersection and paused. From where Miles sat, he could see no driver, only a black interior with a hint of a pale shape. His heartbeat stopped trying to leap and settled into a heavy drum. He killed his engine and stepped out into the blast of warehouse light. The worker in the neon vest flicked his cigarette and waved. Miles waved back and felt irrational gratitude for a stranger chewing mint gum. He stood by his car for a full minute and watched the dark sedan. A long truck rolled through, diesel whispering like a river. The sedan moved again, a slow roll, then a rise of speed. It drifted away down Flint Street and dissolved into dark. Miles opened his phone and called Ruiz. She answered with a tired voice that still sounded like a shield. She told him a unit was nearby. She asked him to remain where he was. She asked if he was alone. He said he was, but the way he said it made it sound as if he was not. A patrol car eased into the lot under the glare. Ruiz stepped out. She had a look on her face that said she wished she could be 2 places at once. She stood next to him, and together they watched the road without speaking for a long stretch. She finally said they had found a vehicle 2 towns over earlier in the evening, plates that returned to a car reported wrecked in another state, interior stripped bare like a bone, windows painted on the inside, no fingerprints worth lifting. She said a neighbor in a farm lane had reported a similar vehicle last week. She said they were not alone in this. The way she said it made it sound like both a comfort and a warning. 2 more weeks passed. The nights grew colder. Nora placed a small baseball bat by the door, even though she had always made fun of people who kept weapons by the door. Miles learned to notice the pattern of his own taillights reflected in the back of delivery vans. He learned the angle that made a plate readable on a dash camera. He learned to repeat details the way dispatch wanted them. His brain felt like a filing cabinet that had been put in order by someone neat and stern. One night, near the end of that second week, the story gathered its last sharp edge. Miles had stayed late to help at the store with the first rush of holiday boxes. He left at 9:40. The town had already put up the lights that make the river look like a line drawn in sugar. He ran the long route past the mall and then cut toward the quarry because the lines there comforted him. The road was empty. At the rise near the water tower, his headlights licked over a parked car near a pull-off. The hood was up, the hazard lights flashed, the driver door sat open a little, a bag lay on the passenger seat, a phone lay on the blacktop inches from the door. Every detail was the same. Every detail was a script. His heart climbed up and tried to hide in his throat. But some other part of him, a part assembled from 13 sleepless nights and the way a tracker feels under your fingers, took control. He did not brake. He did not even slow. He drifted slightly toward the center line to give the scene a wide berth. He watched the door in the corner of his eye. A shape unfolded and stayed low. The hazards clicked off exactly as before. The dark car slipped from the pull-off and rolled out behind him like a toy pulled by a string. Miles did not run. He held 55 like a promise. He let the distance exist. He aimed for Tucker Fuel with a calm certainty that felt like a blade. He pulled into the lot and set his bumper to the glass with the exact same angle as before. Marla looked up with a face that was already moving. She reached for the phone without being asked. She kept her eyes on the road while the call went through. The dark sedan passed the station, slowed, paused, and flowed away. The bell over the door chimed like a heartbeat. Above the counter, an old black and white television crackled with a game he could not see, only the uniforms, white blur against green blur. This time, Ruiz did not go to the shoulder. She did not search the ditch. She had another unit waiting a mile down in the dark, turn that twisted before the bridge. They did not run lights. They sat quiet. When the dark sedan came around the curve, a spotlight hit it from the bank side with a clean square of hard white. The car hesitated. Reed pulled out and pinned the angle. The sedan tried to jump the shoulder. The shoulder dipped and grabbed the front tire. The car skidded and spun once and went nose first into a low ditch that stayed dry even after heavy rain. The engine screamed and then coughed. The driver door flew open and two figures ran into the scrub. They were fast. The deputies chased, but the night swallowed the shapes the way it always swallows what it wants. Back at the car, Ruiz found the windows painted inside with flat black. The interior was stripped, the rear seats were gone, there was no backplate. The front plate was the wrong number by 1 digit, a trick for any casual glance. In the trunk well, where a spare tire should sit, there was only a clean circle and a smell like rubber and glue. Nothing in the car tied to a name, nothing in the field led to a house. The tow truck took the sedan away under a tarp. Ruiz drove by the station at 2 in the morning and told Marla that the car would not be back. She told Miles that the world does not always give you a name you can hold, but sometimes it gives you the absence of a threat, and that is worth something too. She told him this would probably stop now. She told him to keep the camera running anyway. It did stop. Life retook its shape. Not quite the same, but strong. Miles went back to County Road 17 in daylight only. At night, he took the bright route and let the floodlights bless his hood. He kept a small kit in the trunk, water and flares and a blanket because planning soothed him. He talked to strangers a little less, but when he did talk, he looked them in the eye and listened until they were done. Nora teased him about his cautious roots, but her voice had that soft center that meant she approved. Sometimes he would stop by the warehouse on his way home and sit for 5 minutes watching pallets move and lights blink on and off like patient stars. Sometimes he would pull into Tucker Fuel for a coffee he did not need, and Marla would tell him about a stray cat that had adopted the dumpster, and they would stand there in the hum of the cooler and the sugar smell of donuts and admire the way a small animal can survive on a patch of asphalt if it chooses. Sometimes, on a windless night, he would drive the long curve and catch sight of the pull-off where the first scene had been arranged, and he would feel the strange mixture of gratitude and anger that lives in the chest of any person who has seen something near and ugly and survived it. In Rook County, people began to tell new stories at their kitchen tables. They told each other to drive to the light. They told each other to trust their gut. They told each other that help is real, but so are traps, and that both truths can live in the same night. They said the deputies had done good work. They said the night feels different now, but different can mean safer if you do not let fear steer the wheel. One evening in late fall, a thin rain fell, and the river ran high. Miles left the store at 9:40 again and took the bright route by habit. The dash camera winked its red light. He crossed the bridge and felt the tires roll easy on wet lines. At the warehouse corner, a long truck stood still with its hazard lights ticking. A young driver waved with both hands. Miles felt his chest tighten, then felt at ease. He pulled near, not too near, and stayed inside the car while he called the number from the sticker on the truck door. The dispatcher answered and sent a service unit. The driver put his hands up to say thank you and stayed by his cab. No one unfolded from the dark. No one bumped a bumper. A service truck arrived, and the night resumed its plain shape. Miles took a breath that went all the way down. He drove home and sat for a moment with the engine off in the driveway, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the soft, tired rain. Later that night, he stood by the kitchen sink and watched the street through the little diamond window. The porch light made a pale coin on the step. A neighbor walked a dog that wore a tiny raincoat. Somewhere down the block, a television laughed. He thought about how close a person can come to something mean without seeing its name. He thought about a simple rule that had saved him: drive to the light, and he felt a quiet swell of thanks for Marla and for Ruiz and for every forklift operator and truck driver who has ever made a parking lot bright for a stranger at the edge of panic. He turned off the light and went to bed. The house settled, the wind touched the eaves, he lay still, and he listened. The world was not safe, the world was not fair, but the world contained light, and he had seen the way it pushed back the dark when it mattered, and that memory sat in him like a small fire that would not go out. He dreamed of straight roads and morning fog that burned off quick. He dreamed of a sky the color of brushed steel. He woke just before dawn and felt steady. On the drive to work that morning, the river was a wide mirror. The sun climbed slow. The blue sedan held the lane like a faithful horse. He passed the spot near the water tower and did not look too long. He passed Tucker Fuel and waved to Marla, who had propped the door with a brick for the fresh air. He pulled into the lot behind the hardware store and sat for one last quiet moment before unlocking the back door. He looked in the mirror at his own face, older by a notch, sharper in the eyes, and he nodded once, as if to mark the change and accept it. A normal drive had become a real-life nightmare. It had also become a reminder, the kind that hurts and teaches in the same breath. He had listened to the voice that said, "Keep moving toward the light." He had learned the shape of danger on an American two-lane road. He had learned that help is often just a door and a bell and a person who looks up and cares enough to move. He had learned that some nights you choose the route with cameras and forklifts and floodlights, and that choice is not fear, that choice is wisdom. He took the keys from his pocket, felt the small weight, and went inside to start the day. This town has a secret that locals don't talk about. There are towns in America that look peaceful from a distance, where porches sag with old rocking chairs and flags fade in the sun, where roads bend around maple trees and creeks spin under steel bridges. You pass through, you buy coffee, you nod at the clerk, and you move on. Then there are places that hold the air a little too still, places where conversations stop the second you step inside, places where people learn to live by a rule that is never written down. Do not speak about it. Do not ever speak about it. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? I found one of those places on a gray afternoon in late October. A road sign with peeling paint pointed left toward a town called Dunsmuir. The letters were cracked and flaking, like they had been trying to slide off the wood for years. The road narrowed and tunneled under trees. A river ran beside it, dark and quick, and an old steel bridge took me over with a hollow clang. Past the bridge, the town appeared, set low in a pocket of hills. There was a diner with a roof that once had been red, a gas station with a gleaming new pump that looked strange beside the rusted canopy, a church at the edge of town, pale and sunburnt, its doors wrapped in chain. It was 4 p.m. when I pushed into the diner. The bell over the door clinked and kept swinging for longer than felt normal. The place smelled like coffee and fryer oil and lemon cleaner. The booths were covered in vinyl that had split in quiet little lightning bolts. A woman behind the counter looked up, nodded, and poured coffee without a word. She had a soft face and heavy eyes. A clock above her said 4:18. The second hand twitched and hesitated as if it needed permission to keep going. I asked how far it was to the next town. The woman said, "You can get there if you keep the river on your right." I asked if there was a motel nearby. She said there is one by the feed store. I asked about the church with the chains on the door. She looked at the clock. She wiped a clean spot on the counter that did not need wiping. Then she said, "The door is not for you." She smiled, a tiny smile that had no warmth, and poured more coffee I did not ask for. The bell over the door clinked again, and I realized I was the only person in the room. At 5:30, the sky turned early dark, the way it does in hill towns where the sun slides behind the ridge and leaves the streets in blue shadow. I checked into the motel by the feed store. The clerk slid a key across the counter and kept his hand on it for a moment. He spoke without looking up. "Curtains closed by 10, lights off by 11, no music after midnight. If you hear the bell at 3, stay inside." He did not explain what bell. He did not ask for a signature. When I asked about a receipt, he tore a piece of paper from a pad and wrote a number with a slow, careful hand. The pen scratched loud in the quiet room. The room smelled like dust and laundry soap. The blanket was heavy, the kind of weight that feels like a hand. There was a card on the nightstand that listed the rules again. Curtains closed, no whistling after dark. If the television turns on by itself, do not look at the screen. It was printed with a smudged stamp that had bled red into the paper. I slid the card under the lamp and tried not to think about it. Dunsmuir carried an odd rhythm. Streets got noisy and then fell silent, not in a way that matched traffic or business hours, but like the town breathed out and then held its breath. People moved with purpose near sunset, carrying boxes to porches and hanging wind chimes that never moved. I passed the general store and saw a shelf of chalk and twine beside a display of canned peaches. I saw jars of salt stacked higher than coffee. An old man pulled a crate toward the door and stopped when he saw me. He had that same tired look, like sleep had become only a habit. He nodded once. Then he said, "Late day is not a good time for walking. Keep to the motel after dark." His voice was low and even. He did not sound afraid. He sounded practiced. Near 6:30, I heard the first sound of the bell. It was not a bright church bell. It was a low iron sound that rolled across the street and into my chest, the way thunder travels under a floor. It rang once and stopped. A few seconds passed, then it rang again. I counted 7 slow strikes. The sound came from the direction of the church that wore chains like a necklace. The bell rang, and every porch light in town flickered at the same time. Not off, not on. A shiver in the filament, a warning tapped on glass. The church sat beyond a narrow field, set aside from the last corner of houses. Its shingles were curled and black. The cross on the roof leaned like it was tired. The doors were chained with a padlock the size of a hand. The vestibule window had been painted over, but I could see the shape of pews inside, gray rows like ribs. Someone had slid a length of metal through the chain as if to add weight. Behind the building, a line of trees stood like a wall. It looked like a place that had been locked out of its own purpose. I asked about the church at the general store the next morning. The clerk said it had been closed after something happened that people did not agree on. Some said a fire, some said a collapse, some said nothing at all. He asked if I had slept well. I said well enough. He handed me a paper sack with a jar of coffee and a roll of twine inside. I told him I had not asked for these. He said, "Better to have them." Dunsmuir had its stories, and they traveled like moths that lived in a coat. You shook the sleeve, and one would drift out and flutter near your ear. A driver had left a car running on the bridge with the door open. A pair of hikers had gone into the woods and had returned walking 20 paces apart, each staring straight ahead, each refusing to say a word. A trooper had come to answer a call and never arrived at the address. The trooper's car had been found on the bridge, with the radio still crackling, and a hat had rested on the trunk with a dark ring of water around it, like the hat had been placed on ice. The records, so people said, named the call as a noise complaint. The record did not name the caller. There was a sign in the motel office that said, "Quiet hours after 11." Another sign sat behind the first sign, half turned away. "No mirrors uncovered after midnight." I asked the clerk what that meant. He said some things like to be looked at, some things like to be seen, do not give them what they want. He slid the sign flat on the counter and then slid it back again like it burned. I met a traveler at the gas station just before noon. He wore a jacket too light for October. He had the charged look of someone who had not slept. He said he was a photographer. He said he had set up a tripod across from the chain church the night before. He had waited until 3 in the morning when the bell was supposed to toll, and he had clicked a long exposure. He developed the file in his camera and saw the pews filled with shapes that were not there to the eye. He described shoulders and heads and a black edge like a coat collar around each one. In the last frame, the doorway had held a figure that faced the lens and stood much closer than the lens had been. He had left the camera standing in the grass. He was buying gas with cash and leaving. He would drive until the sun was gone and then keep driving. In the early afternoon, I walked the street that ran behind the diner. It led to Willow Creek Road, where the houses were set back and old. Some windows were nailed over with boards so sun-bleached that they looked like bone. In one yard, a swing hung without a seat. In another yard, I saw a stack of stones and a careful little tower. The air changed on that road. It felt still at first, then it felt full, as if it had a texture that pressed against the skin. I heard a sound like a bell far away, and then I realized it was water moving through culverts, making a hollow metallic tone where it hit the rust. I kept walking until I reached a house that leaned hard to one side. The front steps had sunk, so the door looked surprised. When I pushed the door with my foot, it opened an inch and then stuck against something soft on the other side. A blanket had fallen there, heavy with dust. Inside the room, the walls were covered with old wallpaper, roses. The roses had faded into yellow ghosts that climbed halfway to the ceiling and stopped. On the table in the kitchen sat plates arranged for dinner. There were spoons by each plate and a jar of something dark that had dried into a ring. There was a chair tilted back, as if someone had stood up fast and never sat down again. A floorboard groaned somewhere in the back of the house. My skin tightened. I told myself that it was the heat or the settling of wood. I told myself I had fed the house a draft with the open door. I told myself many things that would allow my feet to move again. I turned and left and walked back toward the road with my hands closed without thinking. When I reached the sunlight, my fingers opened, and I saw that I had been holding little flakes of paint that had stuck to my skin. They were the color of dried roses. In my pocket, I found a loop of twine I did not remember putting there. A woman in the feed store saw me stare at the twine and said that people in Dunsmuir had habits that might appear strange. Keep salt by the door, lay twine in loops on the sill, hang a wind chime without a clapper, leave a coin on the top step. She said these were not for good luck. She said these were for balance. Then she stopped speaking, like someone had pulled a curtain. By late afternoon, fog rose from the creek and stayed stitched to the lowest streets. It did not move the way fog normally moves. It held its line along the curb like a dog. When a truck rolled through it, the fog opened like a mouth and then closed again. People went indoors without rushing and shut their curtains with slow, careful movements. The streetlights snapped on. All of them glowed the same warm color, except one beside Willow Creek Road that gave a colder light that made every leaf look wet. A dog stood under that light and did not cross the line into the street. It lifted its paw and then set it down again on the same square of sidewalk and then looked up like it was listening to something that spoke from inside the bulb. At 7, a group of men gathered near the bridge. Each held a paper bag and a lantern with a chimney so clean that the glass almost vanished. They walked down to the water and set the bags on the bank. The bags lay there like offerings for a river that did not want them. One man cut his bag open and poured salt into the current. Another man tied a loop of twine around a small flat rock and dropped it in. The lanterns brightened and then dimmed so muscle-soft that the light seemed to sigh. No one spoke. The men left in a line spaced evenly, as if they were clock hands leaving marks on air. That night, the motel felt crowded with things that were not in the register. Footsteps stopped outside my door and then moved on. A television clicked on in the room next to mine, even though no car was parked in front of that door. I watched the strip of light under the threshold until it thinned. At 2:57, the bell started. It took a breath, and then pushed iron into the night. My chest shook with each tone. The room seemed to lean toward the sound. I counted 1, 2, 3. I stood up without wanting to. 4, 5, 6, 7. I opened the curtain a finger and looked toward the church. The field between the motel and the church held a low, moving shape like water. The chain across the doors had gone slack and lay on the steps like a snake resting in the cool. The bell finished its seventh tone, and then the night held its breath. I closed the curtain and put both hands on the fabric because that felt like a thing I could control. The television in the next room clicked off. Something walked down the hallway, and the light under my door dimmed as if a shadow had bent over it. Morning felt false. The sun came up and burned the fog off the tight streets. The field near the church held circles of flattened grass, each as big as a door. At the diner, everyone looked fresher, and no one mentioned the night. Plates clinked, coffee steamed, the bell over the door clinked at the right times, the clock ticked without stalling. The waitress said that the weather would turn colder by dusk. She said I should take a scarf if I planned to walk to the overlook. Then she slid a folded paper across the counter. On the paper was a hand-drawn map. Do not go past the second switchback. Do not leave the path when you hear water on your left. If you smell iron, turn around. The overlook sat above the river. You could see the way the town folded into itself. Roofs pressed shoulder to shoulder, alleys cut sharp between buildings like seams. The church roof stood like a pale island among darker shingles. Beyond the last house, the woods thickened into a dark line. There were clearings that looked circular from up high, rings where the ground had been scraped clean. The air carried the sound of a truck downshifting on the highway far away, and that sound felt like a gift from a world that worked by simple rules. A notebook turned up at the general store that afternoon. It had been left in a crate beside a stack of canned soup. The clerk said it had belonged to a reporter who had stayed in town for 3 nights. The notebook held interviews that started clear and then turned more sparse, like the person holding the pen had gotten tired, or the people speaking had stepped a little farther away with each page. In the margin of one page, a sentence had been written in a different hand. Speak about it, and it speaks back. On the last page, there was a line written and overwritten until the paper nearly tore. They keep the doors chained to keep the voices in. The clerk said the notebook did not belong to me. He said I could look for 1 hour. He set a kitchen timer beside it. He did not look at the pages even once. When the timer rang, he closed the notebook with both palms and slid it under the counter like a cake coming out of a hot oven. The deputy, who served a nearby district, stopped by the diner before dusk. He had careful eyes and a jaw that held a steady line, the look of someone who had tested courage against landscape and learned to move with it. He sat at the counter and stirred his coffee until the spoon touched the china in a slow, even rhythm. He said the bridge played games with radios. He said chargers failed near the church. He said he could tell you how to get around a truck on a blind curve, but he could not tell you what to do if the bell rang and you were in the open. He paid with a bill worn thin from another pocket and left without finishing his coffee. On my second night, I did the thing I had already promised myself I would not do. I walked to the church after dark. The town had settled into its hush, and the air had that tightness again. The grass in the field held my feet in a soft grip, and the dew reached my ankles. The chain across the doors was taut tonight and silent. I could smell stone. The kind of smell you get from a wet basement when you first open the door. I touched the chain with one finger and felt a faint vibration. It pulsed like the beat of a thing sleeping inside. Around the doorframe, tiny nails had been tapped in at an even distance, the heads marked with chalk. There was a scrap of ribbon hanging from one nail. It had letters printed on it that had faded until only a pattern remained. I stood with my ear near the wood and heard a sound that I have no perfect words for. A voice, yet not one. Breathing, yet not lungs. It was a presence you could hear with your teeth. I stepped back, and the sound stepped back at the same distance. The grass behind me made a hush as something turned in it and then went still. I do not think the people of Dunsmuir hate the church. I think they fear what uses the church as a mouth. They live with it the way a family lives with a sickness that is older than any memory. It does not improve or get worse. It simply holds its ground. You learn the shape of days around it. You find a rhythm that lets you eat and sleep and keep your children inside on the nights that matter. The town had a cemetery on high ground behind the school. The path to it ran beside a stone wall that had seen more hands than any railing. The stones in the cemetery were close together. Many of them were old and unreadable, their faces worn smooth. A few were newer and plain. The newer ones did not list a date of death. They listed a month of birth and then a dash that had been carved and polished and left empty. A dish of white pebbles sat on one of those stones. The pebbles were stacked in a shape like a small tower. At the base of another stone, someone had left a bag of salt tied, shut with twine. From the hill, you could see the whole town, each roof a note on a page. The wind pushed the grass so it laid down and stood up again. The bell did not ring in the day. The bell waited for its hour. I want to tell you exactly what happened on the third night, and I will, but I also want to say that I did not go looking for permission from anyone after it was over. I did not ask the town if I could tell it. No one would have answered. Silence has a way of taking ownership that speech cannot break. So I will set down what I saw and heard, and you can decide what it means for you. I sat in the motel room with the lamp off and the curtains pulled tight. I had placed a line of salt along the door and window ledges in a neat, clean stripe. The television was unplugged. The card with the rules lay face up under the lamp. At 2:50, the air in the room cooled, and my breath came out in a small cloud that faded and returned and faded again. The hallway went quiet, even more quiet than before. 3 minutes crawled by on the clock. Then the first strike of the bell rolled through the walls. 1. The chain of the church slid with weight on wood. 2. A footstep on gravel, soft but different from shoes, the sound you hear when a bare heel presses a stone. 3. A voice outside my door that spoke nothing I understood, not words, but intention. 4. A second voice, speaking the first sentence I had heard spoken by a stranger in this town after dark. Do not answer. The voice sounded like the waitress, or perhaps anyone who had learned that voice is sometimes a rope and sometimes a door. 5. The television clicked on even though it had no power. The screen stayed black, but it had a hum, and patterns moved inside that blackness like fish far below the surface of a lake. I looked at the card and remembered the simple line. If the television turns on by itself, do not look at the screen. I turned my head away and kept my eyes on the zipper of the suitcase on the chair. 6. The space under the door brightened with a light that carried dust in it, dust that moved like breath. The light pressed against the salt in a slow tide and then eased back, like a hand feeling along a locked window. 7. The bell lifted its last tone into the rafters of the night, and the motel creaked like a tree that has survived another strong wind. Silence is not always a lack. Sometimes it fills space and holds shape. After the last tone, the silence felt made, as if it had been built in a shop and fitted into place. The light under the door went away. The hum in the television dimmed and stopped. A single footstep moved away down the hall, then another, each landing at a measured distance, the way a person would walk if they had been asked not to wake a sleeper. I stood very still and waited for the air to warm. It did not. I waited for the urge to open the curtain to pass. It did not. I opened it anyway. The field that afternoon had held circles of flattened grass. Now it held people, or the shape of people, gathered in rows that faced the church. They were not solid. They were arranged like a choir. The chain on the door lay slack again, and the left door hung open to a black the eyes refused to name. The shapes in the field swayed a little and then grew still. I realized that I could not hear crickets. I could not hear anything at all. The quiet felt like a pressure in the ears. Then the shapes lifted their heads, and the air carried the sound of breath, one breath made of many. The breath moved toward the church, and from the dark inside the church came another breath moving out like two oceans pressing against each other at a meeting point. The grass bent in a ripple. My chest tightened as if tied. I slid the curtain closed and stood with my hands on it and whispered that simple plea that anyone might whisper anywhere when the night raises a hand. Please be over. Please let the morning come. Dawn finally came, soft and ordinary. The motel parking lot held wet marks where feet had stood, but they were not footprints. They were circles, each the size of a plate, each a little darker than the concrete around it. The chain on the church hung in a clean line again, and the lock looked dry and new. The diner had fresh pastries on the counter and a smell like nutmeg in the air. The waitress poured coffee and asked if I would be leaving that day. Her voice sounded relieved and tired at the same time. I told her I wanted to understand. She looked at the clock and then back at me. She said that once there had been a mill in the hollow near the church, the creek had shifted and flooded it, and the water stood for a season in dark rooms. Men went in to pull out the machinery. A bell that had hung in the mill and had not been used in years fell and cracked, and the piece that broke off rang once on stone and then rolled into water. After that, the nights became heavy. People woke and found handprints on the inside of windows sitting 10 feet from the floor. Children said they heard singing where no one stood. Many tried to leave. Tires turned to rags just past the bridge. The air in the car turned to glass and made the lungs hurt. A woman drove in circles and ended up back at the feed store with tears on her face and mud up to the door handles. The town stayed. They learned the times. They learned the rituals. They told their children how to live with a thing that pressed without ceasing. Then she wiped a cup with a cloth that had not been in her hand a moment before. She said, "Do not ask more. I like you. I do not want to see your car on the bridge with the door open and the radio talking to itself." I left a little after noon. The highway pulled me like a magnet pulls a nail. The bridge sang its hollow metal song and then went quiet. The river moved under the trees. The road climbed out of the hollow, and the sky opened, and the air felt simple again. I passed a truck that shook its load, and a trooper car set back on a gravel lot, watching traffic, and the sight of that car felt like a promise that rules still worked somewhere. At a gas station 2 towns away, I washed my hands twice and still smelled stone. I bought coffee and drank it so hot it shook my throat, and the burn felt like proof that something could be measured by a simple scale again. A week later, a small padded envelope arrived at my home. It had no return address. Inside was a motel key with a plastic tag that bore a number. There was a folded photograph of the motel parking lot in the gray before sunrise. In the foreground, a window glowed. The curtain hung open half a hand. In the glass, you could see a reflection of the lot and the field and the shadow of a person standing with a camera lifted to their face. The camera was mine. The person was me. Behind that reflection, there was a second reflection that did not belong. It was the pallid shape of the church door held a sliver open, and the clean, bright edge of the lock held between 2 fingers, and you could see the curve of nails like tiny moons. On the back of the photo was a single line in ink. "Leave twine on the sill and do not speak of what you know." That line sits on my desk as I tell you this. I run my thumb over it and the ink feels raised like a scar. I want to tell you that I drove back to Dunsmuir and demanded answers. I did not. I want to tell you that I called the deputy and handed over the photo. I did not. What would any law do with a shadow? What would any law say to a bell that rings without a hand? The world has rules that we can see and touch. Then the world has rules that grow like roots, threading under the road and the house and the floor and the bed. You can pretend they are not there. You can build above them. But if a town learns those rules first, and if that town decides the price of survival is silence, then that town will become a place where breakfast is served hot, and the coffee is strong, and the eyes of the waitress are always a little flat at the edges. Months went by. At night, a few times, I woke to the memory of that iron tone and thought I heard it in the pipes. I kept a coil of twine in the kitchen drawer. I am not a person who believes in charms, yet I tied a loop around the curtain cord and left it there. Once I found a little drift of salt piled near the door when I had not spilled any. I swept it up and then poured fresh salt along the threshold and told myself it was only because winter was coming. There is a rule that travels with this story. It is not mine, it belongs to the town. Do not invite it by speaking to it with the wrong respect. Speak about the town with a pause and a steady breath. Speak about the people with care and with a kind of love, because they are living under a weight that does not lift. If you find yourself on that highway on a gray day in late October, and if you see the old sign with the letters trying to fall away, and if curiosity pulls your hands to the left, think about the chain on the church and the salt on the sills and the bell that does not need a hand to move. Think about the way a quiet rule can hold a place together better than any law. You can keep the river on your right and keep moving. You can tell yourself that the world in front of you is enough. If you ignore that voice and drive down into the hollow, if you drink the coffee and feel the counter vibrate under your fingers when no truck is passing, if you take a room with a blanket that weighs more than it should, then remember the rules you did not ask for. Curtains closed. No music after midnight. If you hear the bell at 3, stay inside. If the television hums without a picture, turn your face away and count to 7 slowly, and then wait for the air to warm. If you walk by the church and your finger finds the chain and feels it breathe, take your hand back and hold it against your own chest until your own breath pushes the rhythm away. In the morning, you can leave. The bridge will carry you like a person carries a sleeping child, with a weight that feels heavier than it should and a care that feels older than time. I do not know what sleeps behind that door. I do not know what the town traded or promised. I know only that the people keep their lives by staying quiet and moving with the rhythm of the thing that lives inside their nights. They will smile at you without warmth. They will tell you how to find the next town without looking you in the eye. They will slide a key across a counter and keep their hand on it for a breath. They will slip you a coil of twine and a jar of salt and not say why. They will not talk about it. They will not say its name. They will live with it and let it live with them. And the bell will ring when it wants to ring, and dawn will come, and bread will rise in ovens, and school buses will climb the hill, and wind will scuff the tops of corn, and the river will turn and turn like a key in an old lock. So, if you ever find yourself near a town that holds the air too tight, and if silence greets you at the door before the bell above it clinks, and if you feel a presence slip into the room like a draft that knows your name, remember this. Some places survive by speaking. This place survives by not speaking at all. And if you stay long enough, you may understand the rule deep in your bones. By then, it will be too late to forget it. By then, you will carry it with you like a small, smooth stone in your pocket, always there, always pressing against your hand when you reach for your keys at night. The basement that should have stayed locked. The house at the corner of Maple Street had a way of shrinking the world around it. The sycamores leaned close over the roof. The sidewalk dipped as if the ground itself did not want to pass in front of the porch. Even in summer, when the rest of town hummed with lawnmowers and late baseball games and the soft pulse of cicadas, that address seemed to breathe in a different rhythm. People crossed the street without thinking. Eyes forward, steps quick. They said it was a shame about the Kellers. They said it was better not to dwell on things that would not come back. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Thomas moved to town at the start of a thick, humid stretch, the kind of air that left fingerprints on glass. He rented a basement apartment behind the old laundromat on Birch Avenue and took a night job stocking at the big box store by the highway. It suited him to work while the town slept. Less traffic, fewer faces to read. He told himself he liked the quiet of empty aisles and the steady logic of boxes that needed to be where they belonged. On a Tuesday after midnight, he cut down Maple on the walk home, backpack slung on one shoulder, shoes whispering against the cracked pavement. There was nothing unusual about the night at first. A single porch light, 3 houses away. A distant train horn sliding through the humid dark. He would remember with certainty the exact moment his feet stopped. It was 12:41 a.m. He checked his phone because the time felt like a pin fastening a page to the wall. In the dirt strip beneath the Keller house windows, a thin rectangle of glass at ground level exhaled a second of light from below. Not a passing car, not a reflection. It pulsed once, pale and cold, and died. He kept walking for 6 steps, told himself it was an appliance dying, a battery coughing its last breath. He turned at the end of the block and came back. The light flashed again from the cellar window, a longer glow, a little brighter. as if something below ground struck a match and held it close to stone. He listened then. The night seemed to hold its breath with him. 3 heartbeats. Then a knock from beneath the earth. 1 knock, a pause, a second. The sound traveled through the dirt and into his legs. He told himself a raccoon had gotten into the crawl space. He told himself the stories were small-town shadows stretching for attention. He stepped off the sidewalk into the brittle grass. The front steps creaked under him. The rusting handle turned with a tired sigh. Inside, the smell hit him. Wet paper, cold iron, a memory of bleach that had never reached the places that mattered. The hallway pressed in. Wallpaper peeled like old bandages. A fan of dust trembled in his phone light. He moved past a living room that still held a couch in a shape that remembered backs and elbows. He moved past a dining room where the table wore a skin of gray and the chandelier hung 1 bulb short like a missing tooth. He found the basement door at the end, a door different from the others. Heavy planks, newer than the rest of the wood. A thick chain threaded through iron eye plates. A busted padlock with teeth marks of rust. He put his ear to the seam. The cold rolled out through the slit and slid over his face. The knock came again, close to where his ear pressed. He flinched. The chain rattled. He pulled the door an inch, and the basement pulled back with a breath he could feel but not hear. The stairs were narrow and damp. Stone walls waited below, black where water wept. He took each step with the flat of his foot, testing for rot. The beam of his phone shivered. It brushed old jam jars on a shelf seeded with white dust. It found a workbench, a coil of rope, a saw with a smile of missing teeth. It found the walls, symbols carved into stone, not careful or pretty, hard and fast, deep where the chisel slipped, circles with tails, lines joined in knots. Rough figures standing in groups of 3. Some of the marks were dark with something that had dried and once had weight to it. He said his own name inside his head as a way of not saying the word leave. He swept the light in a slow arc, and there on a table, warped by damp, lay a leather-bound book the color of old coffee. He touched it. The cover stuck and then let go. The first pages were full of the same figures he saw on the walls. Then writing began, English that tilted up to the right. He read a line and did not understand. He read the next and did. Keep it locked. Do not open. Keep it locked and it will not leave the hole. Keep it locked and it will not know your name. The scratching started above him, a long rag of sound drawn slow over wood. He pointed the light up the stairs. The door at the top trembled as if a draft breathed through the house. The scratching crossed the door. It became a pushing. The chain groaned. He grabbed the book and backed toward the far wall, where 2 cinder blocks looked new against the age of the stone. He saw then a patch the size of a window that had been bricked over with unusual care. Mortar smoother than the rest. No gaps, no cracks. He felt a small wind where no wind should be, and the phone light flicked once. He held the book like a shield and moved. He reached the stairs by feeling with his shins. The chain lifted and rattled as if hands unseen were testing it from the other side. He shoved the door with his shoulder and swung the chain back into place. He pressed his palm flat to the wood. It pressed back with a softness like the throat of a sleeping animal. He did not run out of the house. He walked because running would have turned the hallway long as a tunnel and the porch a mile away. Outside, on the sidewalk, he swallowed the warm night like medicine. He held the book under his arm and did not look back until he reached the corner. When he did look, the basement window was dark again. He told himself out loud that he would return the book the next day. He told himself he did not believe anything the book needed him to believe. He lived with the book on his small kitchen table because placing it anywhere else made the apartment lean. He made coffee and put the book beside the mug. He slept in the early morning and dreamed of wooden stairs under a lake at 3:17 p.m. As he folded a shirt, he heard a thud in the floor, soft like a hand laid flat against a door from the other side. He froze. He told himself a truck outside had bounced over a pothole and the sound had traveled through the concrete. He waited. 10 seconds. Then another soft thud from under the kitchen linoleum. He stepped backward and regretted that his apartment was below ground level. He stepped backward again, and his heel touched the carpet runner that led to his own basement door. He stood at the top of his stairs for a long time with his palm on the knob and the book under his arm. The thud did not come again. He told himself he had imagined it. He told himself that the sound under his feet belonged to pipes and old buildings and air. That night at work, he stacked boxes of toothpaste and bleach and dog food, and the aisles felt longer. At 2:08 a.m., his supervisor asked if he was all right. He said he was fine and realized the words had the weight of someone trying to remember whether they had turned off the stove. By Friday, he had read enough of the journal to understand the shape of the story without the dates he chose not to see. The Kellers had bought the house and learned immediately not to spend time in the basement. The writing made small circles around details and then slid off. They heard things. They saw light where there should not be light. They slept with the windows locked, even in heat. The handwriting changed halfway through the book. The second hand pressed harder, the loops taller, as if the letters needed to take up more room to be louder than the sound from beneath. Keep it locked. Do not put your ear to the door. Do not say your name at the top of the stairs. If you step down with a partner. Do not argue on the stairs. The last page before the leather cracked into the binding had a list. Fix the hinge on the chain plate. Replace the lock when the moon is full. Fill the gap under the door with salt and sugar. When it whispers the names of your dead, do not answer. When it says it is cold, do not answer. When it says it will be quiet if you let it breathe, do not answer. On Saturday morning at 10:27, the metal chair at his kitchen table trembled as if a truck passed outside. The walls did not shake, the glass in the cabinet did not clink, only the chair. He lifted the seat and found 3 grains of coarse salt lined up as if someone had placed them there on purpose. He thought of a prank he could not explain. He swept the grains into his palm and threw them into the sink. That night at 3:03, the radio in his bedroom turned on by itself and hissed a long breath of static. The sound rose and fell. Not a station, not a pattern that made sense. It felt like listening to someone breathe through their teeth on the other side of a heavy curtain. He went to the library because daylight often reduces the size of things in the mind. The local history corner, tucked by the genealogy shelves, held a rolled map of the town from before the highway. A librarian with a name badge that said Mara showed him the index cards for property deeds. He found Keller in pencil and someone else before them, and a gap after. He found a smaller box of clippings that smelled of old basement and lemon cleaner. One article mentioned a boy lost near the river. Another followed a string of break-ins where nothing was taken except photographs from frames. A short column explained that the church on Cedar had once tried to organize a community prayer at the Keller house, but canceled when 2 of the volunteers fell ill on the front steps. The paper avoided words like curse. It used words like unfortunate and ongoing. The librarian lowered her voice to ask if he had known the family. He said no. He asked if anyone had been allowed into the basement when the house was boarded. The librarian paused and said she did not know, and then said she had never seen anyone go in or out for years. On the way home, he stopped at Riggs Hardware and bought a new padlock and a loop of chain and a bag of rock salt because the journal had given him a list, and lists could be useful even when they came from the wrong rooms. He sat at a small table and felt the cool paper of the receipt in his hand and thought about how unreasonable it was to be comforted by an itemized list. He made a plan in slow breathing. He would go back at dusk when the street held more sound. He would put the lock on the chain properly. He would not go down the stairs. He would leave the book under the heavy slab of a toolbox borrowed from the stockroom because the idea of returning the book felt like pulling a nail from a beam that had never squeaked until someone touched it. At 6:12, he stood on the Keller porch with the bag of salt in his left hand and the chain in his right. The door opened like a mouth too willing. The hallway felt the same, the air did not. He could smell metal as clearly as if a handful of pennies had warmed in his palm. He reached the basement door and found the chain as he had left it, but the lock lay on the floor with its body intact and its shackles straight as a finger. The shear had not been made by a tool. He told himself he did not have time to invent what it had been made by. He wound the new chain through both plates and snapped the lock closed. He poured a line of salt along the seam at the bottom of the door. He sprinkled a handful across each stair, and the tiny crystals clicked like sleet. He kept his breathing slow and shallow because he could hear his own breath, and he did not want to hear anything else inside his breath. He left the house and walked to the end of the block and turned around in the middle of the street. He wanted to see whether anything about the house had changed now that he had done something inside it. The sky was a bruised blue, the windows were dull eyes, a single mosquito drifted around his knee, and then the basement window flashed again with a colder light than fluorescent bulbs or phones. He took a step back. The light winked out. He whispered the address in his head and felt the number fall through him like a key. Sunday bled into Monday with thin sleep and thick coffee. He went to work and stocked shampoo and paper towels and metal shelving pins. He tried to think about nothing except the shape of each thing in his hands. On break, he watched the bakery workers frost cupcakes behind glass and imagined a town where basements contained only spiders and paint cans. At one point, 5:09 a.m., his phone vibrated against his thigh where he had set it on a stack of cardboard. The screen lit the inside of the receiving bay like a small moon. No name, no number, just the words withheld and a line of silence when he put it to his ear. He said hello and heard his own breath return twice slower and twice colder than he had sent it out. On Tuesday afternoon, he heard a knock in his own basement. Not a thud, not a settling of the building, a single knock. Then another, the same 2 count as the house on Maple. He walked down his own stairs with the book tucked next to his ribs. The air smelled of dust and laundry soap and something a little sour that might have been old water. He stood with his hand on the light chain, but did not pull it. He told the basement he could hear it. He told the basement he would not open the door at Maple again. He said his own name softly in the middle of a sentence because words can carry names when you slip them safely. At 3:07 a.m., he woke to the radio. Hiss again. And this time, the static had a pattern, like words muffled under a blanket. He listened and told himself what he heard was only the shape of language and not language. Then a word formed that he knew to be his name, even though it did not sound like his name spoken by any person he had ever met. It sounded like someone had written his name on a piece of paper and set that paper on a table and dragged a fingernail under the letters over and over until the paper had worn thin. He took the book to work because he did not want it in the apartment while he slept, and he did not want it in the locker in the break room where other hands might open it. During the quiet part of the shift, he sat on a forklift with the book on his lap and read. The later pages were not entries. They were sentences, like nails. Do not make bargains in the stairwell. Do not agree to anything from the landing. It will tell you that it is not your problem. It will tell you that the ones who kept it locked were cruel. It will tell you that the light in the window means it is weak. It will tell you that if you open the door, it will leave through the front and never return. When you hear it say a name you knew once, understand that it is not that voice and that the person it belongs to is not on the stairs waiting for you to help. He decided to ask someone in uniform for advice, not help. Advice seemed smaller. He walked into the police station on Wednesday, just after noon, and asked at the front desk whether there had been calls about Maple Street. The desk sergeant put his elbows on the counter and said people called about that block every few months, kids and dares and noises. He wrote down the address and nodded to a map on the wall and said a patrol car would swing by. The sergeant asked whether Thomas was a relative of the previous owners. Thomas said no. He said he was concerned about a vacant property and the possibility of people getting inside. He did not mention the journal. He did not mention the marks on the wall. He did not mention how sleep had begun to feel like a room with an unlocked door facing downhill. Later that day, he met Nolan from the stockroom for coffee at the diner with the neon clock in the window. The server called them honey and set down 2 mugs and a plate with pie that tasted like nutmeg and sugar. Thomas told him enough of the story that Nolan's eyes got wide and then smaller, and then Nolan laughed and said a man has to find a better hobby than breaking into houses. Thomas smiled because the conversation felt like folding a blanket neatly after a storm. Nolan said he would walk past the place with him after work for a thrill. Thomas said no very quickly and then softer. Nolan shrugged and said he did not scare easily. Thomas said it was not fear that mattered, it was attention. Some places grew when you looked at them. That night, after the shift ended, they did not walk down Maple. They took Birch and went directly to their apartments. Thomas watched through the blinds until he saw Nolan's living room light come on 2 buildings down. He let his breathing go long and slow. At 2:26 a.m., a thud shook the thin wall between Thomas and the laundry room. Then a sound like someone dragging cardboard across concrete. He stood, and the floor felt like the deck of a boat. He pressed his palm to the wall, and the wall hummed like a tuning fork. He thought of the bricked patch in the Keller cellar and the way the mortar had looked newer, even though nothing in that house should qualify as new. At 2:31 a.m., he heard footsteps on Birch. 2 sets, one heavier and one soft and quick. He looked through the blinds again. Nolan walked fast toward Maple with his phone held like a lantern. Beside him, a shorter shape kept pace. Thomas pulled on shoes and grabbed nothing else because everything else felt like it would slow him down. By the time he reached the corner, Nolan was already on the front steps with the door open, and the shorter figure had slipped inside. Thomas swallowed the taste of metal and followed. The hallway did not so much welcome them as forget to stop them. At the basement door, the chain lay in a loose curve on the floor, and one end of it was black as if it had spent time in smoke. The door leaned off its swollen frame, and in the gap, Thomas could see the top 3 stairs like vertebrae in a spine. Nolan said he had heard his sister's voice on the phone. He said the voice had stopped speaking when he stood near his kitchen sink, and then he had heard it at his back, as if the phone had turned into a mouth. He said she had sounded like she had when they were little and scared on storm nights. He said she had asked him whether he remembered the basement of their childhood home and the way he would count the steps out loud to calm her. He said he had come to count these steps and make a joke of it. He said he would call her as soon as he showed the scary old house that he could walk downstairs without shaking. The shorter figure that had slipped inside had gone down ahead of him. Thomas did not see it then, in a way his mind would let him examine. He would decide later that there are shapes meant only to be noticed by the back of the eyes. He reached out and placed his palm on Nolan's forearm. The skin was cold, as if he had been outside in winter. Nolan looked at him, and the look was the look of a man who has already decided to do a thing and is only waiting to be allowed to begin. Thomas saw the strange softness in the corners of his mouth. He said they would stand on the landing only. He said they would count to 10 and then go up again. He said they would not say any names. He said they would not answer anything they heard. They stepped down. The air on the stairs did not feel like cold air. It felt like the absence of a smell and the absence of warmth and the absence of a sound hitting a wall and returning. The light from their phones found the same jam jars and the same workbench and the same carved symbols. It found the bricked patch. It found scuff marks in the dust where something had traced a circle around the table and then stopped and then traced a circle in the opposite direction. The radio hiss came from nowhere and everywhere. Under it, other noises rose like small things in a drawer trying to slide to the front. They stood on the landing. They counted. 1 to 10 took longer than it should and shorter than they wanted. As they reached 9, a voice rose from the bottom stair, thin with distance but near his breath. It said a word like help, elongated to twice the length that word normally wears. Nolan's face changed like a surface when a reflection moves across it. Thomas gripped Nolan's forearm where the pulse tapped hard. He said the list in the book again. Do not answer. Do not bargain. Do not take a single step down after you promised yourself you would not. At 9.5, the voice said a different sound. Not help. A nickname Thomas understood to belong to a boy in a kitchen long ago. Nolan almost laughed because happiness and grief sometimes look the same when they arrive at exactly the wrong time. He leaned forward 1 inch and the stair under his foot clicked the way wood does when it admits weight. something turned its head at the bottom. The air tilted. Thomas dragged him back with both arms and hit the door with his shoulder and swung it closed and shoved the chain through with fumbling hands. The thing on the other side stepped up 3 stairs with the sound of one step. The door pushed against his back like a slow wave. The chain pulled against the plates. The lock took his shaking and held. He and Nolan stood with their foreheads almost touching because there was nowhere else to look. Nolan's eyes watered as if he stood in bright sunlight. The pushing against the door stopped, but the sound did not. The sound became a long, soft rubbing against wood. Then nothing. Then a knock. The same one, and then 2. The heavy breath passed into the hall and receded. He did not listen at the seam. He walked backward with the book tucked to his chest and the lock pinched in his fingers like a coin. Outside the night was not a relief. The sky hung still as the inside of a cupboard. They walked without speaking to Birch. When they reached Nolan's building, he said he would call his sister. He said he would not tell her where he had been. His mouth trembled like the waterline of a lake when a boat has long gone by. Thomas nodded and did not say, "Be careful," because words turn into loose nails when you need beams. He went home and sat on his kitchen floor and leaned his head against the cabinet. He fell asleep there for a few minutes or an hour. He woke to his phone, flashing a sliver of light on the ceiling and buzzing without a name. He did not answer. The book lay on the linoleum, open to the page with the list. He traced one line with a finger until the letters warmed under his skin. He stood and filled a bowl with salt and went to his own basement door and poured a thin white seam. He whispered that he would keep the door closed because there are doors you close for your own safety, and there are doors you close for the safety of others, and sometimes they are the same door. On Thursday, in the wet heat of afternoon, he found Mara, the librarian, at her desk. He asked a different question. He asked whether she knew anything about a bricked area in the Keller cellar. She swallowed and said she did not, and then she did the thing a helpful person does when small talk is no longer a good coat. She said her uncle had done drywall for the town years ago and had gone to the Keller place once. He had refused to step below the top stair. He had come home and said he had felt a small wind blowing on his fingers from under the door like the breath of something close to the floor. He had said a family before the Kellers had built a wall to hide a well that had once been in the cellar, a well that did not lead to groundwater, a well that led to something else. The town had filled wells before. Old ones that calves fell into or that swallowed loose ash. They had never filled that one with dirt. They had put stones and boards across it and then built a wall to force themselves to forget. Thomas thanked her and walked out into sun that felt like heavy milk. He bought a sledgehammer and a chisel at the hardware store because doing nothing had begun to feel like opening a door by standing very still near it. He told himself he would go at first light when the birds made a lot of honest noise. He told himself he would knock 3 bricks out and then decide what next to do. He told himself that breaking open the seal would be the first step to resealing it properly. He did not tell himself that people who open things often believe closing them will be much easier than it is. At 5:1 a.m. on Friday, he stood on the stairs to the Keller cellar with the sledge in both hands. He took 2 steps down and stopped because the air below smelled like wet pennies and old paper. He took 1 more step and planted his feet as if he stood in a canoe. He swung the sledge in a small, controlled arc because there was nowhere to widen. The head met the brick with a noise that felt like biting down hard on a fork. A shard dropped and skittered across the floor. He swung again. Mortar dust rose and lived in his nose and throat. A third swing loosened a brick the size of his hand. He pried it out and set it down, and his skin did not want to release it. The hole was a mouth as high as his shin and as wide as his palm. He put his ear near, but not to it. He heard nothing at first. He heard a sound, then like distant wind through trees. He realized there were no trees underground. He realized the sound was very quiet and very close, and not wind. He widened the hole by 1 more brick because stopping at 1 felt like a kind of insult that would be answered in a language he did not speak. Through the opening, the dark was not flat. It bent inward like the first step into an elevator shaft. A small rush of cold kissed his knuckles. The smell of iron deepened. He lifted his phone and put the light to the gap. The beam went 5 feet down and then met a shape that reflected light like wet glass. Water lay in a still black circle, waiting for the phone light to land on it so it could pretend to be the sky. A ring of old wood ended where the water began. Iron spikes rimmed the wood like teeth that had lost some but not all of their neighbors. They were wired together with thin strands of dark metal. Small bells dangled on 2 of the wires. He had seen such bells tied to doorknobs at Christmas in houses that wanted to be visited. Here, they were a warning for the inside, a stop for the upward motion of anything that wanted to climb. He heard then a note from one of the bells, so soft he might have dreamed it while awake. Not a jingle, a tart, faint sound like the first sound a glass makes when a finger finds it. He felt the stair under him tilt a hair. He stepped back and hit the wall with his shoulder, and the sledge swung low and knocked the edge of the table, and the leather book slid an inch and settled. He wanted to put the bricks back with gentle hands. He wanted to push them into place like the way you tuck a child into bed. He realized with a clarity that hurt that the wall had not been built to keep people away from the well. It had been built to make time pass more smoothly above it. He whispered, "Keep it locked," and the words did not feel like superstition. They felt like a simple instruction for a tool with teeth. He placed the first brick and the second, and his breath shortened as if he had been running. The mortar he had brought in a plastic tub went on with a butter knife, and the work looked clumsy and young next to the smooth line he had broken. He set the third brick and tapped it and heard the bell below speak again. It sounded like laughter that had not learned the joke. The room changed then, the way a room changes when another person steps into it behind you. He felt a small pressure at his lower back that might have been cold air climbing. He stood, and the phone light swung and found a wet track on the floor, leading from the bricked patch to the foot of the stairs, and then stopping as if a careful stopper had put a palm down and said no farther for now. He lifted the salt bag and poured a thick ribbon across the track. The grains hung in the air for a half second as if tasting, and then fell. He stepped to the door and pulled it shut and fed the chain through and clicked the lock. He pressed his head to the wood. The other side felt like a tongue pressed to the back of teeth. He kept Friday small. He sat in his apartment with the radio unplugged and the book on top of the refrigerator because the higher the object, the less likely it felt to reach up. At 3 a.m. The floor knocked under his feet twice. He said he heard it. He said he was not answering. He said his name inside a word that did not belong to him. Saturday felt like walking through someone else's house while they slept in the next room. At one point, 04 p.m., the laundromat dryer, 2 doors down, stopped mid-cycle and no quarters fell through the slot. He heard a sound like someone blowing across the mouth of a bottle. He ate a sandwich without tasting it. He fell asleep at 7 and woke at 11 because the building sighed. And then he realized that he had not heard the building sigh so humanly before. He walked to Maple and stood across the street in the empty midnight like a piece of furniture on the curb. The house wore its shadow evenly. A stray cat moved across the yard and did not glance at the window well. He went home and sat at the table and turned the book to the last page again. In pencil so faint he could have missed it, a final line waited. If it leaves the hole, it will not want to go far at first. It will want a basement with stairs. It can count. It will want a place. It can learn the shape of your footsteps. It will want to know the names you say when you are too tired to think. Give it none. Give it nothing. Give it back the dark. On Sunday evening, a storm rose the way summer storms do, angry in the distance, and then in the living room all at once. Rain hit the sidewalk like rice. Lightning pressed white against the blinds. The basement under his apartment breathed cool and close, as if the storm had opened something in it. He considered calling someone and could not think who. He tried to imagine how he would explain a well that did not want water. He told himself he would give it back the dark, and he picked up the hammer he kept near his own door and the bag of salt and the book, because the book had been with him for each hour that mattered, and that kind of company counts for something. At 8 a.m., he stood again in the Keller hall. The chandelier strained with a seam of light from the storm. The basement door looked bigger and at the same time tight with its own edges. He placed the book on the first stair because some objects understand where they should be set. He ran his palm along the chain. He touched the lock. The wood felt dry under his hand even as rain sang outside. He opened the door only enough to breathe. He spoke to the dark the way you speak to a dog that is backed under a bed. He said he would bring bricks and new mortar tomorrow at noon. He said he would finish the job before the next sun slid down. He said he would not listen to anything but the sound of the trowel and the bell and his own counting. He said he would not be fooled by names in familiar shapes. The next morning, at 11:02, he stood in the aisle at Riggs and bought 2 bags of mix and a new trowel and a pair of gloves. The kid at the counter asked if he had a project. He said yes and then laughed because the word project landed like a paper airplane in a place where there was no air. He carried the buckets to Maple in 2 trips and felt each trip cut through the heat. He set the first bucket on the porch and then turned back for the second. When he looked again after crossing the street, the bucket had shifted an inch to the left toward the door. He did not go to it quickly. He walked slow and placed the second bucket next to the first, and both were still. He told himself that the porch was uneven and the wood had remembered how to be a ramp in rain. Before he could begin, he saw Deputy Hawkins step out of a cruiser and lift a hand. The deputy had a face that looked older when he was listening. He said there had been a noise complaint last night from 2 streets over. He asked whether Thomas was a contractor. Thomas said no. He said he was a neighbor. The deputy said the town was thinking of condemning the house for real this time and clearing the lot because of kids and fires and liabilities. He said they would get a crew in the next month. He asked whether Thomas had been inside. Thomas looked at the buckets. He looked at the deputy. He said the house had a problem, and it was old, and it did not save receipts. The deputy studied him the way a man studies a map he does not trust. He said to be careful and to call if he saw anyone else trying to go down there. He said the last thing he needed was a group of teenagers going missing because they like a dare. He drove off slowly, watching his mirrors. Thomas worked. He worked in the way that gets inside the skull and quiets it. He pulled 3 bricks and scraped the hole smooth and widened it to square. He looked down and saw the bells waiting like sleeping birds. He poured the first thin wall of mix and set in a brick and pressed. He heard a tiny note from the bell and set the next brick and pressed. He counted the seconds on his phone and pressed again. He waited for the line to take. He spread more and pressed, and when the sound came again, he said he did not hear it. The air thinned. The skin of his neck crawled as if a small hand tested his hair. He did not reach up. He set another brick. The first bucket emptied, and he fetched the second. He moved through the kitchen and imagined the Kellers cooking breakfast in a house that held itself tighter each day around them. He imagined a woman pressing a note into a book because the walls needed more words to stay closed. He returned to the hole, and the smell of iron had softened, and the bells had gone quiet. He set 4 more bricks. He pressed with the flat of his gloved hand and felt the resistance of something that did not like to be touched, but did not know how to avoid it when it came from the right angle with the right pressure and the right not listening. By 2:49 p.m., the hole had become, again, a seam. His work did not match the old work, but it held the way 2 hands can hold, even when one is small. He poured thin salt water into the mortar and watched the line drink. He took the book and set it on the table and put both palms on the cover and said what he had learned to say. Keep it locked, do not answer. Give it back the dark. He walked up into the bright, hard day, and the world felt flat and real and ordinary in a way that made him almost giddy. He laughed once, and the laugh sounded like air finding a pocket that had been sealed. He locked the house door behind him and felt for the first time that the lock belonged to a house and not to a throat. The nights after that were not empty. Nothing goes back to what it was before. But the knocks in his own basement softened to the sound of a building remembering itself. The radio hissed once, and then never again. He slept 3 hours in a row, then 4. He left the book on a high shelf and did not touch it unless he had to move the ladder. He checked Maple each morning on his way home when the sun pressed yellow on the pavement. The basement window held nothing but his own reflection looking down. 2 weeks later, the town posted a bright notice on a stake in the front yard that said work order and a lot number and a date. A week after that, a crew in hard hats and shirts with logos put up a new fence with a padlock and took photographs and measured with a wheel. They nodded and ate sandwiches on the curb, and Thomas watched them leave with the slow relief of someone realizing that the storm had moved far enough away that thunder could be remembered as a story and not a present tense. The night before the demolition was scheduled, he woke at 3:11 a.m. with a clear thought sitting in his mind like a person in a chair. He dressed, he put on boots, he put the book in his backpack, he walked down Maple in the hush that happens before the first bird remembers to be a bird. He climbed the fence because the lock on a fence is a lock on a line, and sometimes a line wants to be stepped over. He stood on the porch and listened. Inside the house, the air smelled like wood and old sugar. The basement door waited with its chain and lock and seam of salt that had turned into a white ribbon glued to the floor by summer damp. He put his palm flat to the wood, and he could feel nothing there for the first time. No breath, no push, no distant bell. He unlocked the chain. He opened the door just enough to whisper the number of days since he had reset the wall. He said he had done what he could with the hands he had. He said the work would be loud tomorrow and then quiet. He said if silence could be a promise, he was making it as best he could. As he turned to go up, he heard a sound that did not make his stomach jump. A small clink like china being set gently on a shelf. He smiled and closed the door and set the chain without hurry. On the porch, he stood very still and looked at the first slice of gray behind the trees. He realized he was crying, small, silent tears like condensation. He wiped them away and did not bother to explain to himself why. The machines came mid-morning. A backhoe took the porch first, and the men shouted the easy words of work that goes as planned. When the bucket took the first bite of the front wall, a dark dust rose, and the driver lifted a hand for a brake while it cleared. Thomas stood across the street with coffee cooling in his hand. He told himself that someday this would be a flat lot with grass and perhaps a new house that would never teach its owners new meanings for the word below. The basement walls came last. The crew hesitated with the hole in the ground. They discussed a plan with gestures that did not reach the street. In the end, they filled the cavity with crushed stone and concrete. The driver said, if a man cannot see his reflection in a thing, it is less likely to think it is a mirror. The foreman laughed and shook his head. They smoothed the surface and left orange cones the way sailors leave lights. That evening, Thomas walked to the fresh slab and stood on it. The concrete held his weight without talking. He imagined the well under layers of stone and powder and weight. He imagined the bells caught forever in a mix of sand and water and Portland cement. He imagined that sound traveling up through solid rock and not finding any ears, because some sounds do not need to be heard to know that they have stopped. He went home and put the book in a box with a tight lid and carried it to a storage unit out by the highway where units sit like teeth in a long, quiet mouth. He signed the paper and set the box on a top shelf and felt the strange lightness that comes when you put something heavy where it belongs. Weeks passed. The town forgot in the way towns do. Someone painted the laundromat door a new blue. The neon clock at the diner stopped flickering. Maple Street at night smelled like cut grass and a little like gasoline when the crews moved their trucks. Thomas went to work at night and came home near morning. He counted the steps to his own basement sometimes as he passed the door, because counting can be a kind of prayer and a kind of promise. On a Sunday evening in late heat and long shadows, he took a walk toward the river. On the way back, he felt the pull of the old address, and he turned down Maple so that he could confirm a thing he already knew. The lot where the house had stood was a smooth gray shape with a skin of dust and two small weeds already testing the edge. He stood at the curb and thought about how people say ground takes what you give it. He thought about how some gifts are heavy and some are not, and how sometimes the only difference is a chain and a lock, and a person who will set the chain again when it loosens. The night rose like a slow tide. The cicadas wound up. A car hissed past. He turned to go, and in the corner of his eye, he saw a pulse of pale light. He went very still. He let his head turn slowly until he looked square at the place where the old basement window had been. There was nothing there now but concrete the color of chalk. The light did not come from the ground. It came from the storm drain at the edge of the curb. A small square of water reflected something not present in the sky. It pulsed once, twice. It went still. He stood without moving. He did not lean closer. He did not speak to the water. He reached in his pocket and found 3 grains of salt that had worked their way into the seam of the fabric and lodged there for weeks. He dropped them at his feet and watched them vanish into the dust. At home, he sat at the table without turning on the light and listened to the hum of the refrigerator and the slow click of the cooling pipes. He waited for the radio that was not plugged in to make a noise, and it did not. He slept and dreamed of a field covered in frost that did not melt when the sun rose. He woke at 6:12 a.m., exactly without an alarm, and knew that sometimes a thing stays locked because a person decides each day to keep it that way. He did not go back to the storage unit for a long time. When he finally did, the box on the top shelf was as he had left it. He brought it down and set it on the concrete floor and touched the lid and then left it closed. He lifted the box and put it back in its place, because some stories work better as weight than as words. He walked out into heat that smelled like tar and rain. He breathed and felt the breath go all the way in and all the way out without catching on a nail or a bell or a stair. He went home on Birch and stepped over his own basement door the way a person steps over a sleeping dog. He remembered the list and understood that it was not a list of rules. It was a list of choices a person could lay out each day like tools. He turned on the coffee. He waited for it to finish. He stood and listened to nothing that he did not invite. He said a sentence without names and without bargains. He said the simple truth of the street and the house and the whole. Some doors must stay closed. Some doors are not doors. The basement on Maple taught him both. He keeps that lesson like a lock in the pocket of whatever he wears, cool to the touch, easy to hold, heavy enough to matter. And on nights when the air goes too quiet, he looks toward the part of town where concrete lies like a lid, and he counts to 10 very slowly, the way a person might count steps in the dark. He keeps counting until morning touches the windows. He keeps counting until the house inside him stays locked. He keeps counting until the world answers with nothing at all. He should have never opened that door. It was late on a Friday night in a quiet town on the outskirts of Pennsylvania. The air felt heavy after a day of rain, and the road that curved past Ashwood Drive shone with a thin black gloss. Porch lights were dim, televisions glowed behind curtains, and a freight train in the distance called out with a low horn that rolled over the roofs like a warning. At the end of the street stood the old boarding house, a brick rectangle with a sagging porch and a doorbell that never worked. Inside that house, a man named Daniel tried to sleep, but sleep had been avoiding him for weeks, and the night had other plans. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Daniel rented a narrow room on the second floor, right above the front door. He worked at a warehouse near the river, sorting shipments that came in long after sunset. He was the quiet type, steady at a job that did not ask questions. He kept a small schedule on his wall, neat and orderly lines with times blocked out for work and meals and the odd call to his sister in Ohio. He did not drink, he did not go out, and he did not believe the stories the tenants traded in the stairwell. The ones about the basement, and the thing that moved in the old crawl space behind the laundry, and the door at the end of the second floor hall that never opened for anyone. At 11:43 p.m., while he was sorting a stack of bills under the glow of his small lamp, the radiator clicked and sighed, the rain ticked at the window, and from the hallway came 3 slow knocks. The sound was hollow and patient. It did not sound like someone calling on a neighbor. It sounded like a rhythm that had started long before he arrived and would continue long after he was gone. He waited. The knocks did not repeat, so he told himself it was the pipes, or the wood, or the wind that rattled the downspout. He stood anyway, as if a string had been tied around his ribs and tugged him toward the door. He opened his room and leaned into the hall. The overhead light's hum buzzed through a yellow haze. The carpet was thin and stained near the edges. At the far end, past the framed exit map and the dusty fire extinguisher, stood a door that matched none of the others. It was a touch taller, a touch narrower, as if it had been measured for another house and shoved into place here, a compromise in wood and paint. He knew the stories, that it was a storage closet, that it was a sealed stairwell, that it did not exist, and everyone else was bored or cruel or both. He also knew that when he first moved in, he counted the doors on both sides on his way to the far end, then counted the windows from the street, and the numbers did not agree. The landlady, Ms. Whitcomb, waved him off with a thin smile. "Old houses have tricks," she said. "Old carpenters make mistakes." He wanted to believe that, so he did, right up until 11:43 p.m. When someone, somewhere, knocked 3 times and asked to be heard. He walked toward it. The carpet gave a tired sigh under each step. When he got close, he smelled damp earth, like a garden shovel pulled from a hole. He touched the knob. It was cold, colder than any metal should be in a hallway with steam heat hissing from a register. He told himself not to turn it. He told himself to go back, lock his own door, and wait until morning. Then he heard a whisper that was hardly a sound at all. He stood very still. The air felt thinner. The lights flickered as if they were trying not to look. He told himself that words can be imagined, that one voice can be another voice in disguise. The whisper came again, almost kind, almost a hum, drawn out through teeth that did not belong to a face he could picture. He turned the knob. The latch slid back without resistance. The door opened an inch and stopped with a tired groan. A draft slid through the gap and brushed his face. It felt like the first breath from an old cellar or the mouth of a tunnel that had not seen daylight in a very long time. He raised his lamp. The light reached into the opening and touched nothing. No wall, no shelves, no stored paint cans or broom. The darkness did not behave like a shadow. It looked like a place where light did not live. He shut the door. He locked it. He pressed his palm to the frame and felt a tremor pass through the wood, like something unseen had placed its hand there as well. He walked back down the hall and did not run. He closed his room, turned his own lock, and leaned back against the door with his eyes closed. His heart stuttered against his ribs. He told himself he did the right thing. He told himself that he had not actually opened it at all. Then he noticed the smell of damp soil in his room, and he noticed that the wind had stopped, but the curtains still moved. At 12:07 a.m., the knocks returned. Not at the end of the hall, right behind his head. 3 slow raps on his own door. He shouted that it was late, that he would call the police, that whomever it was had the wrong room. The knock stopped. A soft scrape moved down the bottom edge of the door, like fingers feeling along for a seam. He stayed awake until 3:11 a.m., with the lamp on and the window cracked. He woke hours later with his cheek on the desk and light pushing around the shade, like a gentle threat. He almost convinced himself it was a dream until he saw the scrap of paper pinned under his mug. The paper looked ripped from a notebook. He had no notebook like it. 3 words had been written with a blunt pencil. "You let me." He lifted the note with 2 fingers and felt grit on the bottom, tiny grains that looked like sand from a riverbank. He set it down and felt the house breathe. He decided to go to work early. He turned and found the door to his room, not where he left it. He had left it on the wall that faced the hall. Now the wood stood 2 feet to the right, the door frame had moved with it, the paint edges were clean. The old screw holes that should have shown where the hinges lived were gone. For a long moment, he thought he had simply misjudged the distance. Then he stepped back and saw a pale rectangle of wallpaper that had been spared by some old dresser, and the rectangle no longer lined up with anything. He said his own name out loud, the way someone falling says a word to hear a human sound, and he left for work without breakfast. For a few days, he did not touch the far door. He did not walk to the end of the hall. He took the stairs in the back and left by the kitchen because the front porch swayed under a weight he could not see. He heard stories from the others. Nora, on the first floor, said something brushed her ankle while she folded laundry, and no one else was in the room. Jonah, in the smallest room under the attic, said his alarm clock rang at 2:13 a.m. Every night, even when he unplugged it, and one night when it rang, he felt something cold pass over his face, as if it was testing how he breathed. Ms. Whitcomb said the water bill had doubled and no one had taken longer showers. They said these things with the nervous humor of people who want to hear themselves deny what they fear. By the end of the week, the knocks came on the front door at odd hours. 3 deliberate raps and then silence. A delivery showed up with no return address, 1 box of nails, and a hammer that looked like it had been in a fire. The porch light went out and could not be coaxed back to life. When the postman came, he asked if they had started digging in the yard. He said he could smell wet clay when he dropped the mail, and someone had left a shovel leaning against the porch rail. No one owned a shovel like that. The blade had been ground so thin, it flashed like a mirror when the sun cleared the clouds. At 9:26 p.m. on a Monday, he came home to find the hallway colder than the outside air. He reached his room and saw that his lamp was on and his window had been raised, though he remembered very clearly lowering it before he left. He went in and froze. On his bed, placed on the folded blanket as carefully as a gift, lay an old brass key. The teeth were sharp, the bow worn smooth by long use. There was a tag tied to it with a bit of frayed cord. The tag had 2 words written by the same blunt pencil. For you? He held the key and felt a pressure in his ears, as if he had driven up a mountain without noticing. He knew, without any logic, that the key would fit the door at the end of the hall. He also knew that the door had not needed a key when he turned it a week ago. He set the key on the desk and told himself he would ignore it. At 10:01 p.m., his light dimmed, not like a line sagging on the grid, but like a hand placed over a mouth. The key slid across the desk with a soft metallic breath and fell into his palm. He went to the hall and walked to the far door before he could give himself a reason not to. He did not want a reason. He wanted the space between the knocks to end. He pressed the key into the lock. The metal welcomed it. He turned his wrist. The tumblers whispered. The door swung inward without sound. The dark inside pulled at the light in the hall. The bulb did not flicker this time. It simply failed, like an eye that refused to look. He held the door with a shaking hand. He raised his lamp and leaned forward. The air smelled like iron and moss. The floor beyond the threshold did not look level. It tilted down and away, not like a staircase, but like a slope, as if the door opened to a place that was beneath the house and also someplace else. He said hello, then winced at the sound of his own voice. The dark answered with a slow rasp. It sounded like breath pulled across brick. He shut the door and locked it with the key and hung the key on a nail above his bed, determined to prove that he was still the one who decided where things belonged. He did not sleep until dawn laid a smudge of gray across the ceiling. He dreamed with his eyes open and saw a field of doors set into the ground like gravestones. In the dream, he walked between them and counted. He could not finish. The field did not end. The next day, he told himself he would leave. He packed a bag with shirts and socks and the metal photo frame of his parents on a motel patio near Lake Erie. He called his friend Victor, who worked nights as a guard at the warehouse, and asked if he could crash on his couch for a few days. Victor said yes, though he sounded worried by the request, and he told Daniel to arrive after midnight when his shift ended. At 7:15 p.m., Daniel turned his lock, shouldered his bag, and stepped into the hall. He saw fresh footprints on the thin carpet, bare footprints, long and wet, moving away from his door and toward the far end. There were no return prints. At the far door, the footprints faded and stopped. The handle was wet. There was no water anywhere else. He left by the back stairs. The alley behind the house held 2 trash cans and the ghost of a vegetable garden that had never taken. The sky threatened more rain. He cut across 2 blocks toward the bus stop. As he walked, he passed a storefront with a narrow display of lamps and secondhand dishes, and in the glass he saw the reflection of the back of his head. Behind his reflection, though, behind the glass, in the store that should have been locked and dark, he saw a door with a tall, thin frame. It stood where no door should be. It stood the way a finger points in reprimand. He did not turn to look. He kept walking and kept his eyes on the gutter where rain gathered and slithered. He took the late bus. He tried to read. The lights in the bus hummed and dipped. A man, 2 seats back, muttered that everyone should sit down and be quiet, even though everyone was already sitting and no one was talking. Daniel got off near the river where the warehouse stood like a row of gray teeth. He waited for Victor by the back entrance under a buzzing yellow light. At 12:02 a.m., the side door opened and Victor waved him in with a quiet nod. They walked past cages stacked with boxes and the whine of a forklift that was bored with its job. Victor asked if he was all right. Daniel said the house felt wrong and he needed a few days away. Victor said he could stay as long as he wanted, that his couch had a good view of a boring wall, and sometimes a boring view could heal things that moved too fast. They reached the small security office. Daniel set his bag down and leaned against the metal desk. Then he heard it again. 3 slow knocks. Not on the warehouse door, not on a wall. From behind the metal cabinet in the office where no door could hide, Victor heard it too. He narrowed his eyes and walked to the cabinet. The sound came again. 3 knocks that rolled down the metal like water. Victor put a hand on the cabinet and yanked it away from the wall. Behind it was nothing but cinder block, cold gray squares, and mortar like dry bones. Victor swore and shoved the cabinet back. He stood still for a long moment, the way a dog stands when it hears something you cannot. Then the office light blinked and came back, and he looked at Daniel and did not smile. They left together at 2:04 a.m. and walked to the parking lot. The river moved like heavy glass. A fog bank drifted near the pilings. Victor drove while Daniel watched the rearview mirror. Streetlights passed in even intervals. On the third light, Daniel realized that each time the car rolled under the glow, he saw a tall black rectangle standing in the reflection, as if a door had been placed behind the back seat and bent the mirror as it passed. He did not look back. He watched the mirror and kept his hands flat on his thighs. Victor lived in a basement apartment under a dentist office on Maple Street. The walk down the short set of steps felt like a dive. The air smelled like coffee grounds and old magazines. The couch faced a small television and a shelf of paperbacks. Daniel sat and tried to slow his breathing. At 3:11 a.m., the sound came from the hallway outside, the simple and terrible shape of 3 knocks, and Victor went to the door with a baseball bat and flung it open. The hallway was empty. A draft slipped over his shoes and ran past Daniel on the couch as if something had been waiting to be invited. Victor shut the door and slid the chain and stood with his mouth open, then walked to the couch and put the bat down and said they would get a priest or a contractor in the morning, he did not care which. Morning did not help. The day stood gray and slack. Victor called a cousin who knew a handyman, who knew a carpenter, who had a story about a walled-up passage in a row house in Reading. The carpenter came at 1:02 p.m. with a belt of tools and a calm face. He listened while Daniel said what he could. He nodded the way people nod when they decide to accept things so they can move toward the part where they fix it. He went to the old boarding house with them. He stood at the end of the second-floor hall and looked at the tall, thin door that waited without impatience. He took a small square of mirror from his pocket and held it in the opening when Daniel turned the key and moved the door a few inches. The carpenter watched the mirror with a still face. The mirror did not show darkness. The mirror did not show anything. It did not show the hall behind them. It stayed blank. He closed the mirror and said that sometimes there are doors that are not doors, sometimes there are holes that were not dug, and sometimes a house is built over something that does not agree. He ran his palm down the frame and felt where the wood had been sanded, then scarred, then sanded again. He said there was an old story in towns like this about a set of steps with 11 risers and a 12th riser made of empty space. People would count and be satisfied, then put a foot down and fall where there was no step. He said there were also stories about men who bricked up their sins and slept sound after, until one night the mortar breathed. He set his bag down and took out a pouch of salt and a small mason line and a chalk plum. He had learned the habit from a mason who drank black coffee at dawn and swore that chalk lines remember the world the way it should be. He hung the plum by the frame. The string shook. The weight turned slow circles and would not settle. He asked for a hammer. Daniel brought the burned one from the porch, untouched since the delivery. The carpenter frowned at the black marks on the handle and did not use it. He used his own. He set 3 screws into the frame and 3 into the door and tied them to the line. He ran salt along the threshold until it looked like surf. He told Daniel to leave the door closed, locked, and tied, and to keep a light burning through the night so he could see if the line broke. He said he would return in the morning with a proper plate and a brace. He said to call if the salt moved. He stepped back and looked weary suddenly, like the room had taken a small bite of him, and he left with a quiet nod. At 2:09 a.m., Daniel woke to a soft hiss. He sat up and saw the salt rolling back from the threshold as if an invisible tide was pulling it inward. The string shook. The screws sang, a tiny metal whine like a sound a child could hear when a television is on. He stood and held the key and did not know what to do. The strings snapped with 3 sharp tings. The screws turned. The door eased open, not toward him, but toward the dark that hungrily accepted it. He might have turned and run. He did not. He pressed the door closed with both hands and braced his feet and felt something on the other side pushing back with a slow, patient strength. He said, "Please stop." He did not even know to whom he spoke. The pressure eased. He turned the key. He leaned his forehead against the paint and stayed there until light began to creep around the window shade like a spy. He called the carpenter at 7:04 a.m. The call rang and rang. He left a message and waited. He called again, no answer. At noon, he walked to the corner store to buy coffee and bread and found a small crowd gathered by the alley. A police cruiser sat with its lights quiet but its engine running. 2 officers stood near a man on the ground with a sheet over his chest. The sheet was bright white against his boots that stuck out one end. A neighbor said the man had been found at dawn, stretched out near the dumpster, with a look like a person who left a task unfinished. Daniel felt the world narrow. He asked a woman in a scarf if she knew who it was. She said the man had a belt of tools on the curb. A leather pouch lay beside it with salt in the seams. A plumb bob sat under the bumper of a dirty sedan. Daniel said he needed air and he walked until he could not see the alley anymore. He did not return to the boarding house until evening. The door at the end of the hall waited. His own door stood where it should be now, as if the house had grown tired of the joke. He tried to pack again. He put the key in his pocket and told himself he would toss it into the river on the walk to the bus. As he zipped his bag, the room breathed cold. The window lowered by itself an inch and shut with a soft kiss. The lamp dimmed and brightened and dimmed again. He heard the knock. 3 steady raps, not from the hall, not from his door, but from inside his closet. He opened it with a small sound in his throat that could have been a laugh. The closet smelled like cedar and mothballs. An old coat that belonged to a tenant who never came back brushed his arm. The back of the closet did not hold a wall anymore. It held a tall, thin door, the same shape, the same handle. His head swam. He closed the closet and leaned his back against it and said the words he had read on the note. "You let me." He left that night at 10:27 p.m. He did not turn off the lamp. He did not lock his room. He went down the front steps where the porch sagged and turned left. The street looked longer than it ever had. He reached the corner and stopped. A man stood beneath the big sycamore that tilted over the curb. The man wore a coat that hung like a curtain. He faced away. He lifted a hand without moving his shoulder and knocked gently on the air in front of him. 1, 2, 3. The sound traveled to Daniel as if it had been made on wood near his ear. The man lowered his hand and walked across the street without looking left or right. He moved like a sleepwalker. Daniel took a step back. He went the other direction toward the church where the lights were always on for a little while after the hour. He did not pray. He sat in the last pew and watched the red exit sign burn like a coal and listened to the building creak as if it also had a spine and a set of tired ribs. The next morning, a city inspector arrived after a call that came from no one they could later identify. He wore a jacket with a seal and carried a clipboard with forms attached by a rusty clip. He walked through the house and looked at wiring and pipes and the water heater that rattled when it started. He reached the second floor. He paused at the end of the hall. He looked at the tall, narrow door as if reading a note in a language he almost remembered. He tried the handle. It did not turn. He wrote something on his form and left. On the way out, he told Ms. Whitcomb that old houses collect strange corners, and sometimes those corners collect a smell, and sometimes the smell is not a real smell but a memory of one. She nodded and smiled with her lips only. When he had gone, she climbed the stairs with a hammer and nails and a square of plywood. She stood at the door and waited. She did not raise the hammer. She walked back to her office and called a number she kept in a small book. No one answered that number either. The days after that did not break into clear pieces. Time smudged. He slept in fits. He saw the key in places he did not leave it. On his pillow, in the sink, inside his shoe like a small tongue. He took it to the river and threw it hard. It struck the water with a plunk that felt too small for the weight it carried. He watched the ripple widen and then close like a wound. He walked home and found the key sitting on his desk with the cord tied into a neat bow, as if someone with patient fingers had waited years to learn such a simple knot. Victor stopped by at 8:31 p.m. with 2 coffees and a man from his church who read quietly from a small book and asked to walk through the house with them. The man did not announce anything. He did not demand or command. He listened. He stood in the hall at the far door and said the place felt like a mouth pressed shut. He walked to the basement. The basement had a low ceiling and a strip of dirt floor near the far wall, where an old support post sank like a stake. The man crouched and touched the dirt and rose with a look of distant thought. He said he did not think the house was haunted in the simple way people like to say. He thought the house had been built over a path, like a country lane that had once run from one field to another. The lane did not end when the field was plowed. It kept going under what came after. He said some paths want travelers, some doors want to be used. He said someone long ago had opened a door here and did not shut it correctly. He said someone had tried to build a wall where a door did not want to be. He said none of this was about belief. It was about the shape of a wound and the way it will not close if a piece of it is missing. He asked Daniel what he had heard first. A knock, Daniel said. 3 knocks. The man nodded. He said 3 knocks are polite. They are the old way. They mean a traveler is asking permission. He said the worst thing you can do is open the door when the traveler has asked, and you do not know who it is. If you open, you become a host. If you refuse, the traveler goes on. He looked at Daniel with eyes that had watched factory smoke for years and said that sometimes the host does not know he has become one until the first guest is already in the kitchen. That night, Daniel tried to follow orders. He placed the key in a bowl of salt. He drew a line of chalk across the threshold of his room and across the far door. He set a chair under the knob. He sat and waited. At 1:03 a.m., the chair slid quietly aside and settled a foot away, as if a careful hand had pushed it and did not want to scratch the floor. The chalk line broke without footsteps crossing it. The key rose an inch in the bowl and rested again as if nodding. The door in the hall did not move. The closet door inside his room did. He heard a breath, slow and deliberate, in a space that could not hold anyone. The breath did not rush. It took its time. It sounded like a tide that had finally decided which way it meant to go. He left a recording on his phone for whoever might come next. He spoke into the small microphone with his voice pulled tight. He said he was sorry for whatever he had done, even if all he had done was turn the knob of a door in a hallway that should have been boring. He said he did not believe in curses. He said he believed in mistakes. He said he felt like a man who had signed a contract written in invisible ink. He left the phone on the desk with the recording playing on repeat, like a small litany. In the morning, the landlady knocked on his room and called his name. He did not answer. She opened the door and stepped in and felt a chill ripple her skirt. The lamp was on, the bed was unmade. The phone on the desk whispered the last line of his recording over and over in a thin loop. I did not mean to let you in. The closet stood open 2 inches. The far door at the end of the hall stood open a foot. A line of damp soil ran from the far door to the closet and stopped dead at the sill. The bowl of salt sat empty, with a faint ring near its lip, as if something with many small hands had taken its measure. The police came and did what police do. They cataloged, they measured, they took photographs that flattened the room into rectangles and squares. Officer Nolan walked down to the basement and stared at the strip of dirt and came back up and wrote that the ground smelled like a place beside a river after a flood. He stood by the far door and looked into the dark that did not show the hall reflected in his pupils, and he decided to step away. The report said missing person. The report said no sign of forced entry. The report said the tenant had been under stress. The report did not say that Nolan woke that night at 3:11 a.m. in his own home to the sound of 3 polite knocks that came from inside the linen closet, and he lay still until the knocks moved on like a traveling show. Weeks passed without weeks passing at all. A new tenant toured the building and said he liked old wood and cheap rent. He took Daniel's room. He lasted 3 nights. He left a note under the rent box that said sorry and 2 jackknives on the table, as if the color of their handles had been a promise he wanted to keep. A woman who taught at the middle school moved into Nora's old space and smiled at the stairwell like an actress who believes in second chances. She told a colleague that the house hummed like a distant generator even when the power was steady. She told no one that her alarm shifted to 2:13 a.m. and stayed there no matter how she set it. She left during a rain on a Tuesday afternoon with a single backpack and a plant under her arm that shook as if a breeze was in the hall, but there was no breeze in the hall. The landlady started to sleep on a cot in the office downstairs because the phones rang without calls, and she decided she would rather be the first to hear than the last. She opened the ledger and ran a finger down the old page where the house deeds were copied out for no good reason except that someone had liked the look of handwriting. She found an entry about a previous owner who had poured concrete in the crawl space and then broken it up with a sledge when the water would not run right. She found another entry about a boarder who spoke to the wall in the laundry room and said the wall spoke back with a voice like a voice in a metal pipe. She closed the ledger and told herself stories about plumbing and air and a bad memory that walks in circles. At dawn, she raised the blinds and found a small brass key on the windowsill with a tag that said, "For you." She went very still and did not touch it until noon when she put on a pair of gloves and used 2 fingers to flick it into the trash. She took the trash out to the can and set the lid and walked inside and locked the back door. When she returned to the office, the key sat on the desk with the cord in a new bow that no one had tied. On a night with a clear sky and a slow moon, a group of teenagers dared one another to throw pebbles at the boarding house and run. They stood under the sycamore and whispered the way teenagers do. They were not cruel. They only wanted to feel their hearts rise. They crept along the fence and raised their arms, and at that exact moment, a soft knocking sound came from the fence itself. 3 polite raps that carried the texture of wood, though the fence was iron. They broke and ran. All but one who stood with his mouth open like a fish, because at the end of the second-floor hall, a door was open, and in the dark behind it, a figure stood. The figure looked tall, but also wrong, as if the lines of the body had been drawn with a rule that did not match the human sketch. The figure raised a hand, the knock came again. The boy ran so fast, he left his shoes. A year did not pass, because we will not count years. The house gathered dust in the places no one cleaned. The porch leaned a little more. The door at the end of the second-floor hall sometimes stood ajar for no one, and sometimes closed itself with a courtesy that felt like a joke. When a storm rolled up the valley, the house held its breath, and the lights in the kitchen flickered and stilled, and for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator showed its true note, and you could hear the shape of something that had been here longer than wires or motors or rain. Detective Reed, who was older than his haircut and younger than his eyes, stopped by every few months to ask if anyone had heard from the missing tenant. He stood at the foot of the stairs and looked like a man waiting for a train that would never come to this platform. He took notes that he did not keep. He asked the same questions. He did not ask about doors. One day, he sat alone in his sedan outside the house and watched the second-floor windows for an hour. At 3:11 p.m., when the street was quiet and a dog barked twice and then thought better of it, he saw a shape slide past the far window and pause. The shape did not move like a shadow made by a person. It moved like the afterimage in your eye when you stare at a light and then look away. He started the engine and drove to the municipal lot and sat with his head in his hands until the sensation passed that a set of steps was missing beneath his feet and he would fall if he tried to stand. There are people who believe they are too practical to be lost. They do not understand that a path that runs under a house has no use for belief. The door at the end of the hall is still there. Most days it is only wood and paint, holding the quiet air of a staircase that does not exist. Some nights it is not only wood. On those nights, the hallway feels longer than it did at noon. The bulb burns with a halo. The carpet nap looks pressed in the shape of feet that stood and waited. When you stand there, if you are foolish enough to stand there, you will feel the air lean toward you. It will feel like the moment a stranger steps too close on a bus, polite and invasive at the same time. You will hear nothing at first. Then you will hear 3 knocks. Then you will hear a voice that speaks like a man who will not raise his voice because he does not need to. People who live far away will say that doors do not work that way. They will say a story is a way for a house to make sense of its creaks. They will say a man named Daniel had a bad week and made a bad choice and then made another. They will be right and wrong in equal measure. What is true is this: he should have never opened that door. He did anyway. He did a simple thing, and the world made of wood and light and time turned a few quiet degrees. We do not always see the turn. We feel it. We wake at 2:13 a.m. because an old clock in an old place has decided that is the right time for a soft hand to try a knob. We hear 3 knocks that are polite because the old ways are more patient than we are. We tell ourselves to ignore them. We do. We do not. We stand up and walk to the hall and place our fingers on a piece of metal that is colder than it should be, and we turn and we learn that some doors do not open into rooms, they open into unfinished invitations. On certain quiet mornings, the landlady pauses at the mailboxes and believes she hears someone at the end of the hall speaking very softly. She thinks she hears a man apologizing. She thinks she hears him say he did not mean to be a host. She stands very still and swallows, and the sound goes away. She does not tell anyone. She checks the keys on the hook. There is one more key than there should be. She does not touch it. She turns the sign on the front door to no vacancy, even when she has 2 rooms free. She tells herself it is for safety. She tells herself that boarding houses work best when they are a little empty. She tells herself that one day she will take a hammer to that far door and break it into a pile of obedient boards. She tells herself many things. At 11:43 p.m., on nights when the rain moves sideways, she hears 3 slow knocks and looks up from her chair, and for a second, one small second that stretches, she thinks she will answer. If you visit Ashwood Drive and you stand under the sycamore and you look at the second-floor window at the end of the hall, you might see nothing but the tired curtains sagging inward as if the house is swallowing. Or you might see a thin line darker than the rest, the seam of a door that is not quite shut. You might hear a knock, even if there is no wood within reach. You will be tempted to knock back. People are tempted by small rituals. Do not do it. Walk away while you can, walk to the corner, and do not look at your reflection in the storefront glass. If you do, you may notice a tall black rectangle standing where no door should be, and you may learn the trick too late. The trick is not that the door follows you. The trick is that once you have opened it, there is no place left where it is not. The house stands and waits. The train still calls with its low horn. The porch light still fails and returns when it wants. People still move in and out with boxes and hope. They tell one another that every town has a story like this. They say the names wrong and get the times mixed up. None of that matters. The rhythm is what matters. 3 slow knocks, a pause, 3 more. The whisper that sounds like breath pulled across brick. The cold metal of a knob at the end of a short walk that can take the rest of your life. The way a man speaks at the edge of a choice and thinks he has time to think. The way a door waits forever and never gets tired. He should have never opened that door. He did. And now, on certain nights when the air is wet and the street is quiet and the hum of the wires makes your teeth buzz, you can stand very still and you will feel it. The world has a seam in it. Someone is on the other side of that seam with their knuckles raised, and they are polite, and they are patient, and they are calling on anyone who still believes a door is only wood, the terrifying secret hidden in plain sight. In the quiet town of Ashford, people often said that nothing truly bad ever happened there. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, neighbors waved as they drove past, and children rode their bikes freely through the streets until dusk. It was a town tucked away from the chaos of bigger cities, surrounded by thick woods that stretched for miles and bordered by an old railway line no longer in use. To outsiders, Ashford seemed ordinary, almost boring. But for those who lived there was always an unspoken awareness that something about the town didn't feel right. There were whispers, subtle things that people preferred not to talk about, but every so often a reminder surfaced and the silence became heavier. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? It was late autumn, the kind of evening when the sky turned a dull shade of gray long before the sun had set. The air felt heavy, damp with the scent of wet leaves. That night, a man named David was walking home from the small diner where he often had coffee after work. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional car passing by, headlights cutting through the mist. As he crossed Main Street, something caught his eye. A house just beyond the corner where Elm Street began. He had passed it countless times before, but on this night, it looked different. The blinds were always drawn, the windows never lit. For years, everyone in town walked past it without question. No one ever saw the owner, no cars parked outside, no movement behind the curtains. It was just there, standing quietly, as though it had been forgotten by time. But now, a faint light flickered in the upstairs window. David slowed his steps. The glow was soft, almost like candlelight, and with it came a shadow. A tall figure moved across the window, its head tilting unnaturally, as though it was aware he was staring. A chill rushed down his spine. He looked away quickly and continued home, forcing himself not to glance back. The following morning, when he mentioned it to a coworker, she frowned. "That house?" she said, her voice lowering. "You mean the Miller place?" She leaned closer. "Don't pay it any attention. It's better if you just don't look." Her words unsettled him more than the sight itself. For weeks, David tried to forget it. But every evening when he walked past, he couldn't help but notice. Some nights, the light was gone, the windows dark. Other nights, he would see the same shadow, moving back and forth, stopping suddenly, as though waiting for him. And each time, he felt a strange pull, a curiosity he couldn't explain. People in town began to notice his unease. At the diner, old men who gathered for morning coffee would fall silent when he asked about the house. A woman at the grocery store shook her head, muttering under her breath, "Not again, not again." Finally, one stormy night, he couldn't resist anymore. Rain poured in sheets, and thunder rolled in the distance. The streets were nearly deserted, the sound of water rushing into gutters filling the silence. David stopped in front of the house. The upstairs light was glowing again, brighter this time, and the shadow appeared almost immediately. Without thinking, he stepped off the sidewalk and crossed through the gate. The air seemed to shift the moment he touched the iron latch, colder, sharper, as though the storm itself had grown quiet just to watch him. The front door was unlocked. It creaked open slowly, revealing a hallway lined with faded wallpaper and dusty wooden floors. The air smelled of mildew, dampness, and something faintly metallic. The silence inside was deafening. He called out, his voice shaky, but no one responded. Slowly, he made his way toward the staircase. His shoes left prints in the dust, proof that no one had walked there in years. Yet upstairs, light poured through the crack of a door. When he reached it, he hesitated. His hand trembled as he pushed it open. The room inside was small, lit by dozens of candles arranged in a circle on the floor. In the center stood a chair, and strapped to it with fraying ropes was a mannequin, its head wrapped in cloth like a shroud. At first, he thought it was nothing more than an eerie display, maybe some strange joke. But then, the mannequin moved. Its chest rose, and a faint rattling breath escaped beneath the cloth. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a loose floorboard. Suddenly, the candles flickered wildly, though no wind had entered the room. The mannequin's head turned slightly, straining against the ropes, and the cloth shifted, revealing skin pale, bruised, and very much human. His stomach dropped. Someone was tied to that chair. He rushed forward, fumbling with the knots, but the moment he touched the rope, every candle went out at once, plunging the room into pitch-black darkness. A voice whispered, low and guttural, right next to his ear, "You shouldn't have come." David staggered back, heart pounding, searching for the door in the dark. The air grew heavy, thick, pressing against his lungs. Then the candles flared to life again, but the chair was empty. The ropes lay on the ground, cut clean, and the cloth was gone. The figure he had seen moments before had vanished, yet the air still carried the sound of breathing, slow and steady, coming from behind him. He didn't remember how he got out of the house. The next thing he knew, he was standing on the street, soaked in rain, staring at the darkened windows. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his keys. That night, he locked every door, closed every curtain, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't erase the sound of that whisper. In the days that followed, something strange began happening. At work, he found objects moved from where he left them. In his apartment, the television would flicker on by itself in the middle of the night, static buzzing in the silence. Once, as he turned off the bathroom light, he caught a reflection in the mirror that wasn't his own, someone standing just behind him, face obscured by a cloth. He stopped walking past the house. He avoided Elm Street entirely, but no matter where he went, he felt watched. The shadow had followed him, hidden in plain sight. In crowded grocery aisles, he'd see the outline of someone too, still among the moving people. On the bus, in the reflection of the glass, he'd notice a figure standing where no one should be. At night, when he lay in bed, he would wake to the sound of ropes tightening, fibers straining, as though someone were struggling to break free in the dark corner of his room. Others in town began to notice too. They whispered when he entered the diner, eyes darting toward him before quickly looking away. One evening, an elderly man finally approached him, his voice trembling. "You went inside, didn't you?" he asked. David nodded slowly, unsure what else to say. The old man sighed heavily, shaking his head. "That place doesn't keep its secrets kindly. Once you see it, once you hear it, it never lets go." David never spoke of what he had seen again, but the changes were undeniable. His eyes grew hollow, his voice quieter, as though drained of something vital. Friends stopped visiting, unnerved by the feeling in his apartment, the way the air seemed colder, heavier whenever they entered. The town carried on as always, people avoiding Elm Street, pretending the house wasn't there. But everyone knew, deep down, the secret hadn't gone. It was still there, waiting in plain sight, behind drawn curtains and flickering lights. And every so often, when someone new passed by and felt the pull of curiosity, the cycle began again. Because in Ashford, the most terrifying things were never hidden deep in the woods, nor buried in forgotten graves. They were right there, in the middle of town, waiting for someone to notice. And once you did, there was no escaping it.